Good morning. We're ready to start, and welcome to all the members of the public. Thank you so much for coming to the meeting. I know this is an additional meeting of the Medical Board of California, and we really appreciate your attendance. I want to ask everyone to please turn cell phones to either vibrate or turn them off, and board members to keep Blackberries off the table so it doesn't interfere with the feedback from the AV system. Board members will be using their laptops to access materials during the meeting, and just wanted to make clear that that's the purpose of the laptops on the table. This is an official meeting of the Medical Board of California. We have a designated time on the agenda for public comment on items not on the agenda, as well as an opportunity for comments by members of the public on every item on the agenda. The board welcomes public comment on any item on the agenda, and we will ask for comment prior to taking action on any agenda item. If for some reason I forget to ask for public comment, which happens periodically, please, and you wish to speak on that item, please raise your hand, and I know one of my colleagues will remind me that I have forgotten to make that request. And Ms. Toof, if you have an interest in speaking, please fill out a speaker slip. They're on the back table, and give them to Ms. Lisa Toof, who's sitting up here at the front table. If you decide to speak prior to having filled out a slip, that's fine, but I'd ask you to please fill out a slip after the fact so we have a complete record of the speakers at the board meeting. I'm going to, given the size of the agenda and our desire to have as much engagement as possible, I'm going to ask speakers to please limit themselves to 3 minutes. And we have a timekeeper. And we will use the timekeeper during the agenda. Our plan is to end today at 3 o'clock, and we plan to take a lunch break at noon during the meeting. If necessary, we may take some items out of order to accommodate the schedule. I'm going to call the meeting to order now and ask Ms. Toof to please call the roll.
Dr. Bishop?
Here.
Dr. Diego? Dr. Gonadev?
Here.
Dr. Lowe?
Here.
Ms. Pines?
Here.
Dr. Salmonson? Ms. Shipsky? Mr. Serrano-Sewell? Mr. Togami?
Present.
Ms. Yaroslavsky?
Present.
Dr. Yip?
Yes.
Dr. Levine?
Present.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm delighted to be able to introduce to all of us Mr. Phil Togami, our newest board member. Mr. Togami was appointed by the governor in May of this year, and he comes to us with enormous experience, both in the public sector and the private sector. He's a real estate developer, an Oakland booster, and one of the first citizens of Oakland, who's had a tremendous impact on redevelopment of the city of Oakland. He's the CEO of the California Commercial and Investment Group and managing general partner for the California Capital Group. He has sat on numerous public commissions, too numerous to list given our agenda today, but we're delighted to have him and to have the benefit of his perspective and both his public and private experience, his experience both in the public and private sector. And I'm going to, and he comes to us most recently from the California Lottery Commission. So we'll have to figure out what the link between the lottery and the Medical Board of California is. So,
Opportunity.
Opportunity. All right. Mr. Togami, I'm going to ask you to stand, and I'm going to read the oath of office. So, repeat after me. I, Philip Togami, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
And I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States
and that I bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of
and
California,
the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
and I will well and dutifully discharge the duties which I'm about to partake in. Thank you
Congratulations
very
and welcome
much.
to the medical
Thank you.
board. Right.
For the record, I will say that being sworn in is better than being sworn at.
That's true. That's very good.
And Ms. Tooth, please note for the agenda that Mr. Serrano Sewell has arrived. Great. I'm going to move to agenda item 2. I'm sorry, agenda item 3, public comment on items not on the agenda, and I have one slip. Ms. Yvonne Chung.
Good morning, members of the board. Yvonne Chung, representing the California Medical Association. I wanted to bring to your attention a quick issue at the joint forum on appropriate prescribing that was co-sponsored by the Medical Board and the Board of Pharmacy in February. There was a discussion regarding corresponding responsibility on the part of pharmacists and the need for pharmacists to verify prescriptions before dispensing medication. CMA, working together with the California Pharmacists Association, has identified some confusion among our members regarding the definition of appropriate corresponding responsibility and how it is exercised. We found that there's a lack of guidelines and standardization about the appropriate amount of information needed on the part of the pharmacist in order to verify the legitimacy of a prescription. For example, some of our physicians have received requests for extensive portions of the medical record, including MRIs, past test results. Some pharmacists have wanted to go look at the record and then corroborate the physician's diagnosis before dispensing the medication. This has resulted in some conflict between pharmacists and physicians, resulting in disruptions to patient care and even threats of enforcement action against physicians for failure to comply with pharmacy policies. We are requesting, we being the California Medical Association and the California Pharmacists Association, a presentation which would include representation from the Board of Pharmacy and a discussion on this issue at your next meeting. And we appreciate your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other members of the public who would like to speak on items not on the agenda? Seeing none, we will proceed with the agenda, and we will proceed to agenda item number 4, approval of minutes from the April 25th, 26th meeting.
So moved.
Second. Oh, we do corrections?
First, any corrections, additions, or comments from board members?
I have, oh, go ahead first, go ahead. There's
So,
others.
I think a typo, page 4. The hospital cited for the CIT rather than SIGHT.
Right, and it's, did everyone hear that? It'd probably be helpful for us to have a mechanism for correcting typos that sort of automatic, that we can hand our edited or email our edited typo non-substantive corrections to someone.
Mine is substantive.
Ms. Yaroslavsky?
Mine is substantive. I think on page, item number 4-12, 43,00. I'm not sure if it's $43, 43 cents, or $4.30 on the cost. And on page,
I'm sorry, which page are you on?
wait, so it's 4-12. It's on page, under AB 496, Gordon. The board's portion is estimated to be the same as before, and then it says 43, and I'm not sure if that's an amount of what that is. And since we're going to have to pay, doctors are going to have to pay for it, or the board's going to have to pay for it, I wasn't sure. 43,000, missing a zero, $43, missing a period. So it is a
We need
typo, but
clarification of.
and then there's another one with my remarks. My vote is on page 4-16. It seems that I made a motion to oppose something that was passed. So I think maybe the motion was to This is the Physical Therapy Association. Therapists would be allowed to, we talked about changing the word diagnosis to assessment. And if I made a motion to oppose and everyone voted for it, I don't think I did that. Did I vote to, so I want someone to just check when they have a chance to.
Okay.
That, please, 'cause I don't think I would have made a motion everyone would have opposed. I mean, you know what I'm saying. I wouldn't have opposed something everyone else was supportive.
No. Everyone supported your motion to take an opposed position
Oh, I
on the
apologize. That
bill.
was my reading. I apologize. My
Yeah.
brain is not functioning 100% yet. It will be eventually.
Okay, any other corrections?
Sorry.
Ms. Simoes,
The opposite.
could you clarify on 4-12 what the amount, on AB 496, for the record, what the,
It's 43,000.
so it's just one missing zero. Thank you very much. Ms. Dobbs?
Just one other misspelling on page 4-31. Glasgow should be Glasgow.
Glasgow, Scotland. Got it. Okay. Great. Any other comments, corrections? Okay. May I now have a motion to approve the minutes with the corrections submitted?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any comments from the public on the minutes of the April meeting? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Madam Chair, please register me for abstaining.
One abstention, Mr. Tagami. Thank you. I'm going to now move to agenda item number 5. And we're going to now consider agenda item number 5. The board members received on May 28th an email from the executive officer, Linda Whitney, advising the board and Ms. Kirkmeyer of her intention to retire effective June 1, 2013, which she did. The only outstanding matter now to be considered in closed session is the appointment of an acting executive director. Once the board takes an action on this matter, we will return to open session and announce the results of the closed session. We are now in recess and will immediately reconvene in closed session. We ask those who are not a part of the closed session to please exit the room. Thank you very much. Okay, we're back live, and I want to reconvene our meeting in public session. And I'm going to now move to agenda item 6, announcement of actions taken in closed session. I'm very pleased to announce that the members of the board unanimously have asked Ms. Kim Kirkmeyer to serve as interim executive director until such time as a search process is completed for a permanent fill for the position. And the board members had an opportunity to have a conversation with Ms. Kirkmeyer, a frank and open conversation in which we expressed our confidence in her and her ability to lead the medical board staff, to work with the board, to set out a vision and to help us begin to do the important work that lays ahead for us in the next months and years to ensure that not only are we committed to public protection, but that the fact of that is known and trusted by members of the public. So I appreciate all of you being here, and I want you to join me in congratulating Ms. Kirkmeyer on her appointment as interim. Great. Are there, do any of the board members want to have a comment or question to make? Okay. Then I have one speaker slip from a member of the public on this agenda item, Stephen Ellis. Dr. Ellis is not here. Okay, well, are there other members of the public who would like to say anything on agenda item 6? All right, then we'll move on to agenda item 7. Mr. Jeff Sears, who is here with us today from the Department of Consumer Affairs, is going to share with the members of the board and members of the public the procedure for selection of a new executive director.
Good afternoon, Dr. Levine and members of the board. Thank you for this opportunity to be here. Department of Consumer Affairs shares the board's confidence in Kim. We've worked with Kim for many years and look forward to working with her for many more. I'm going to pass out a summary sheet that outlines the process that the department, I'm trying not to feedback, the department follows typically in these situations. The first step in the process, as Dr. Levine said earlier, was that the board appoints a selection committee, and that can either be by appointment or by via volunteers. And the selection committee or recruitment committee would work then with the Department of Consumer Affairs Office of Human Resources throughout the process. Components are an evaluation of the duty statement for the position and updating revisions if necessary, determination of the recruitment methodology, and approval of the recruitment bulletin, the advertisement, if you will. And beyond that, it would be the responsibility of the selection committee to review applications and resumes when they come in, determine which meet the criteria that the board or the selection committee establishes for the screening of the initial applications. Then the selection committee can either interview their top candidates, or they can forward those top candidates to the board for a full board interview in the future. Typically, the selection committee will do an initial interview to winnow down the candidate pool to the top 4 or 5 candidates for the board. A lot of the staff work is done by my staff in the Human Resources Office. However, it is a significant responsibility and workload for the selection committee. So those of you who may wish to volunteer, I want you to think about that workload, because the pace that this process moves depends upon how fast the selection committee can take care of their components of this process, including scheduling. We'll schedule interviews, but conducting initial interviews, establishing screening criteria, and actually screening the applications. So,
any board members have questions for Mr. Sears about the process? All right. Any questions about the process from members of the public? If not, then I'm going to ask for volunteers to serve as a selection and recruitment committee to work with Mr. Sears on reviewing and updating the duty statement and the competencies for the executive officer. The last time that was revised was in 2004.
Correct.
And it's almost a decade later, so it is worth our attending to that. Dr. Gnanadev, and could I have, and Mr. Tagami?
Sure.
All right, great. So we have 2 volunteers, and we will proceed with that. And Mr. Sears will give you his card. Great. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're going to proceed now to Agenda Item 8, status of update on actions taken at the April board meeting. And we're going to start with Ms. Jennifer Simoes, who's going to talk about SB 62 and where we are with that.
Okay, good afternoon. SB 62 is the bill that would require coroners to report deaths to the medical board when the contributing factor in the cause of death is related to toxicity from a Schedule 2, 3, or 4 drug. At the last board meeting, the board voted to change its position on SB 62 from support if amended to support due to the amendments taken. A support letter went out on May 8th to Senator Price and the Senate Appropriations Committee. This bill was heard in the Senate Appropriations Committee on 4/29/13, and I testified in support of SB 62. This bill was put on the suspense file due to the fiscal impact identified. However, this bill passed out of Senate Approps 7-0 on 5/23 and passed out of the Senate 39-0 on 5/28/13. This bill is now in the Assembly. The next step will be for it to be heard in the Policy Committee, but a hearing date has not yet been set. Staff will continue to work with the Author's Office, the Assembly Business and Professions Committee, and interested parties on this bill. And this concludes my update, unless there are some questions.
Have there been any amendments to the bill subsequent to our last?
There have not.
Thank you very much. Board members? Any questions? Thanks so much. We're going to, sorry, I do have a member of the public who wanted to speak on, Tina, next, got it. Okay, thanks. So we're going to move on to the, report on use of the cures data, and Laura Sweet is going to provide a report. And just for context for board members and members of the public, the medical board has a large stake in the functionality and accessibility of the Cures program, California's prescription drug monitoring program. It is currently in a situation where I believe its funding will expire July 30th.
And I believe there's pending legislation that will address this, which will be a very good thing, yes.
Right, which hopefully will be passed on an urgency basis. Right. But it is a critical piece of our work, and it's a critical piece of the work, of the workflow of both prescribers and dispensers in the state. So thanks.
Okay, great. So I'd like to just give a little bit of background about Cures, and then how we, in the investigation, a component of our cases, utilize the Cures. So CURES stands for Controlled Substance Utilization Review and Evaluation System, and it is currently administered by the Department of Justice. It originally evolved from the triplicate prescription program that was created in 1940. And then at that point in time, the California Triplicate Prescription Program was the oldest running multiple copy prescription program in the nation. Currently, Cures collects Schedule 2, 3, and 4 prescription information on a weekly basis via an electronic data system. And it allows pre-registered practitioners, pharmacists, law enforcement officers access to it on an instantaneous basis 24 hours a day. And these are the current boards who have access to Cures. Including the medical board, there's the Board of Pharmacy, Dental Board, Nursing Board, Osteopathic Medical Board, and Veterinary Board. The two primary functions are prevention and intervention, and investigation and enforcement. So physicians who are utilizing cures can access something called a patient activity report. And this enables a physician to determine what a particular patient is doing, who is prescribing these scheduled drugs to the patient, and where the prescriptions are being filled. And so this is a tool for the physician to identify a patient who might be procuring drugs in a pattern that is detrimental to the patient. The patient activity report is only available to prescribers and pharmacists, and of course we can also access that. And that's what the form looks like. Now when we actually get the patient activity report, this is what the document looks like. This has been redacted, but it gives us the name of the drug, the quantity, the strength of the drug, where the prescription is being filled, and it gives us the date of birth of the patient, which is valuable information to us when we are investigating these cases. And as I mentioned, benefits for the prescriber is that a physician can become aware of a patient who may be drug seeking. And the benefit for the patient is that a physician is not going to be reluctant to prescribe if a patient truly needs or requires a scheduled medication. Back in 2009, the prescription drug monitoring program went into effect with cures. And this is when the online data became available. And once the Department of Justice receives and approves an application, the requester then has real-time access to the database, and there's information there on how to request that information. What I'd like to do at this point is talk about a real case scenario and what happens when we receive an allegation alleging overprescribing or inappropriate prescribing, and just walk that case through our process. And this is based on an actual case study. So in this particular case, our central complaint unit received a complaint from a medical doctor, and we often receive complaints from medical doctors, from family members, from other law enforcement entities. That's how prescribing cases often come to our attention. And this physician said that his own patient told him that this subject physician would prescribe whatever he wanted. So one of the first things the analysts in the central complaint unit do is look at the physician's priors to determine whether or not they've got either prior complaints or discipline. And in this particular case, the subject physician had already been on probation for drug-related violations. So the CCU analyst then orders the cures report, and this case revealed a 1,281-page cures report, which was pretty significant. So,
sorry, that's 1281. That's a report of the physician?
Yes, that was the physician. So, and in some cases, that in and of itself, if this is an oncologist or somebody who's specializing in pain management, that in and of itself might not be problematic. But right off the bat...
So you guys know how to identify that in comparison to their specialty then?
That will be one of the things that gets established. Mm-hmm. So in this particular case, now, if the subject did not have priors or there was not an open pending complaint, this case would have had to go through our upfront review process pursuant to Business and Professions Code Section 2220.08. But in this particular case, because of the prior discipline, this case would go straight to a district office so that we could expedite the investigation. However, if there had been no priors in this particular case, this case would have had to, the analyst would have tried to get medical records, get a statement from the physician, send it out to a consultant, and then that case would get referred to the field. So in this particular case, goes to an investigation, goes to an office, gets assigned to an investigator, and one of the first things the investigator will do will order a specific cures report for the patient MC. And in this particular case, there's 16 pages of hydrocodone bitartrate prescriptions in a 3-year period. In January 2005 alone, the patient received 780 pills. May 2007, the patient received 960 There was some pharmacy shopping and some doctor shopping revealed just on the cures report. So what the investigation will do at this point, the investigator and the medical consultant will review the entire cures report for the physician, those 1,281 pages, and they will look for other types of patterns. They will look for the geographic location of the pharmacy where prescriptions are being filled. They will look at the ages of the patients. There are certain warning signs depending upon the age of the patient. The red flag kind of danger criteria escalates. Combinations of drugs will pique our curiosity. If we're seeing a lot of the same things over and over again, if we're seeing, even if we see therapeutic amounts of drugs, if there's an enormous volume of population and no variation among the drugs that are being prescribed, if family members are all being prescribed the same drugs from the same physician, these are all signs that we will pay close attention to. So in this particular case, another patient that stood out, patient AB, there's 52 pages of drugs prescribed for this individual. Variations of hydrocodone filled on the same day at different pharmacies, and this pattern continues. So at this point, knowing this information, here's just a sample, so you can take a look at what the actual report looks like. So on this particular cures, this is for the patient. You can see the variety of pharmacies that are being used. That's typically a red flag. The quantity of drugs is a red flag. Sorry, I didn't realize there were so many examples of those. So investigative options are going to depend on this type of case. Currently, our approach on prescribing cases, one of the most efficient ways we find to establish what is happening in a practice where we see this type of a pattern is to do an undercover operation. It's expedient. You can know right off the bat kind of what's happening. We also might conduct surveillance. There are cases where an investigator will just go in and sit in the waiting room and listen to the transactions that are happening between the reception staff and the people come up. Some people will come up and just give a number, and the receptionist will hand out a script. So these are just various techniques take place, but if we can proceed criminally, we will. If there is sufficient probable cause to procure a search warrant, this is probably the most expeditious way to approach these cases, and we've been doing that more and more. Sometimes search warrants, we can't meet the burden of probable cause to execute a search warrant, and what becomes burdensome and time-consuming for us is if we have to issue a subpoena to take them. So we cannot look at the patient's records, these potentially drug-seeking people. We can't just go get their records. We have to request their permission to look at their records. And folks who generally are utilizing medications in this type of manner don't really want the state medical board looking at their medical records. So we can get into some protracted subpoena enforcement situations in these cases, which ends up making the case take too long. So cures in and of itself cannot be the basis for either a search warrant or a subpoena. So we can't just take a cures report and then just say, okay, judge, we have enough information here. We have to supplement it. We have to supplement it with additional information, to determine whether or not there is sufficient evidence to proceed. So we've had some cases recently where there were cures reports reviewed by experts for the board, and because of the problems with cures, because of the lack of accuracy, cures has a tendency to not have all prescriptions in it. Sometimes there's duplicate information. So the investigators actually have to go out and get the physical prescriptions to make certain that the information is accurate, so that we're not getting duplicates, we're not getting information that has been erroneously inputted. So this can be a time-consuming process.
You say the Cures report can't be the sole basis. Is that a statute, a regulation, or just your experience with judges?
It's just the experience with judges. There's nothing in statute that talks about that. But, for example, if there was a situation where you do have an oncologist who has a very impressive-looking cures, then you really wouldn't want us relying on that solely to go forward with the search warrant in that scenario. So I think it's to be extra cautious, and of course, you know.
And so the standard for the judge is probable cause.
Correct, for a search warrant, and it's good cause for a subpoena. Yes.
So within the information that I've heard you describe up to this point, what is not part of the equation are the number of patient visits with that doctor that's receiving these prescriptions?
That's correct. We wouldn't know that from Cures.
So from Cures, you know that doctor is prescribed to that patient.
Well,
you don't know that patient has received prescriptions from multiple doctors.
Well, we would learn that by running that patient activity report. So the 1,281-page report is the physician, and then we ran the additional report on the patient. Now, the patient's report will show us multiple doctors, multiple pharmacies, so we can access that information.
So as part of the refinement of Cures, would it not be helpful for your team to be able to have available some kind of a methodology for pulling out of Cures by patient name, or by, not name, but by patient prescription? There's got to be some kind of identifying something for a patient as well as for doctors. So if patient A is going to 10 doctors receiving 500 Vicodin a day, is there some way of gleaning that or rewriting the Cures so it would be more helpful?
Not currently, it doesn't exist, but with the appropriate funding, I think anything's possible in terms of data extraction for Cures.
Sorry.
Dr.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, if I'm a doctor where this patient comes to me, what type of information can I pull out from Cures to see?
If you've signed up for the patient activity report, and from what I understand, that's also, to be honest, a cumbersome process right now because of lack of staffing. So doctors are having a hard time actually getting signed up, and you have to have it notarized. But once you are good to go, you can query and request that patient activity report, and it will let you know within some semblance of accuracy who's prescribing to this patient, what they're receiving of the scheduled medications, and where those medications are being prescribed. So it's a very useful tool for prescribing physicians. But again, it's not as accurate as we would like for it to be.
Just want to confirm what you said. Many emergency room doctors came and complained to me that they cannot sign up for Cures database because they are the ones who are put on the spot. Somebody just comes for pain, but they can't even sign up. So,
right, and that's part of the funding issue. That's critical.
Should there be a law in place? Should we be looking to have a law in place that says that any doctor that's going to be allowed to prescribe a Schedule 2, 3, or 4 drug has to be a participant in the Cures program? Would that be a help?
Well, the problem is that even ultimately, once Cures is updated, that would be the time to look at
what improvements to be made.
Requirements about the use of Cures. But currently, 12% of prescribers, physicians in the state, are signed up for Cures, and about 8% of dispensing pharmacists. So, and the issue is, if you call there, you get a recording that says, "Sorry, due to lack of staffing, we're unable to process your request at this time." So, everyone is aware of this, and there's a great intention to fix this problem.
Okay. So basically, Cures is a phenomenal roadmap. It gives us kind of a starting point. But in order to prove these cases and prove that the standard of care has been breached, the next step would be record review. So the medical records of all the patients in whom we're interested are secured. And one of the things that the law requires us to do is factor into the equation the pain management guidelines. So we have to make certain and be mindful that we are not depriving patients who really need pain medication of their scheduled medications. So the Pain Management Act has 7 guidelines that must be met and followed. So we're looking, the medical consultant, the investigator, the team, the attorney are looking at these medical records to see whether or not we can determine if the pain management guidelines have been met. And then if the case warrants further scrutiny, we will invite the physician in to attend an interview. And then lastly, the case will be sent out to an expert reviewer who makes the final determination whether or not the standard of care has been breached. Now, we can, on these cases, for the egregious prescribing cases, also need expert testimony in order to proceed with these cases criminally. So most of the prescribing cases, all of them, I can't think of one that has gone criminally that we have not also taken an administrative action. So I contacted the Drug Enforcement Agency as part of this presentation just to see what they're doing currently, because they're kind of in a similar position. They used to have a private entity that provided them with information as to the top prescribers, which they no longer have. They're using Cures also, but they're suffering from the same problems that we're suffering with, and that's lack of accuracy. And they actually have an analyst who takes what data they have and inputs it and manipulates the data, but they're kind of in the same boat that we are with lack of funding. So,
can I ask you one? Does the Department of Justice have an ability to monitor the extent to which pharmacies are actually submitting on a weekly basis the reports they're supposed to be submitting?
Dr. Levine, I don't know the answer to that. I can find out for you, though.
Okay. Dr. Gennady?
Apparently, the pharmaceutical companies which make these drugs get all the data, but the doctors who prescribe can't get them. We can't get them. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, it should be easy with full HIPAA protection. I mean, that's required, but it should be easy for a physician to get in there, sign up first, get in there, and look.
Absolutely agree.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Takami.
Through the chair to staff. We're getting this as an informational report, and I appreciate the data coming. And perhaps we can divide this into a couple steps. So what you've presented is kind of what is, and then there's an array of opinions and ideas as to what ought to be. And it seems that whatever ought to be has other agencies and other resources that would probably need to provide some input and would probably, as you were referencing, need some funding and a process to implement, because it needs to be done on a very broad basis. Is there a recommendation that you have that you would suggest to the board along those lines, taking us beyond the informational report? Or are you looking specifically for some board direction as to what process we would go through to undertake that?
Do we have a task force in place?
Well, I would, we were talking about this yesterday. We would love to see a task force or staffing similar to what we have for our Operation Safe Medicine, where we have a unit dedicated to a particular problem, and we can have staffing, because these cases do take a lot of time. When you're dealing with very remote geographic areas, just the travel time, it's hard to just bop up to, Eureka or something like that. So if you had a team dedicated, preferably I would want to see something like 6 investigators north and 6 south, that we could tackle this. And another benefit of this would be these are time-consuming cases. You extract these cases from the current investigators' caseloads. You have more reasonable caseloads for investigators, which will, I think, improve our time.
Mr. Takami, was that what you were getting at?
Yeah, I think that gets to the heart of it. I think that I appreciate it being an informational report. And so the next steps question really is how to differentiate from what the professionals who are doing this every day are requesting by way of tools and suggestions. And so those recommendations would need to be accompanied with cost and what other permissions and or communications are required to make it effective, and then how much time is needed to actually implement it, because ultimately it's looking to perfect the case that a judge will then support that can be acted upon to bring closure and enforcement. And so that's a piece of this that I think that needs to come into focus. And from that, I think it's then specifically what they ask of the board is by way of permissions as it relates to funding and process, to make sure that as a new program is implemented, how's it done within a approved or modified budget? Are the funding sources readily available or able to be redirected? What the implementation time is, and then what the checkup is to make sure that this new direction and program has the effect that was, or the impact that was intended.
Dr. Diego?
Yes, I had a couple of comments. One of them is, like Dr. Donovan had said, in the past it has been difficult for physicians to sign up. I think the biggest thing is to go get your things notarized. Like, physicians really don't have time to run to the notary public. Thank goodness that there's more of those available after hours. So when we do that, we should think about that. The other thing is that I was thinking, just in terms of education for the entire physicians, because it's not uncommon for us to review cases where, like, the physician didn't know that they were, like, completely deviating from the, I guess, what you call pain management guidelines in terms of education for the entire medical society. Do we post that, or should we post that?
We have. We've
website?
Posted it in our action report, and we've reposted it. I believe we've posted it 3 times. But I absolutely agree. You can never.
Like,
I mean,
keep it posted
right
constantly.
Once in this environment, I don't think we can post it enough. So.
It is currently on our website. So.
And there are 2 sets of things. One is the pain management guidelines, and the second is the appropriate prescribing guidelines for opioids, which at our last enforcement committee meeting, we had asked that a task force actually be convened, including interested parties, to look at the guidelines and to look at needed revisions. And Dr. Bishop and Ms. Yaroslavsky had agreed to co-chair that. So hopefully that will, and CMA had offered resources. There are lots of changes in the world of opioid prescribing, and this is a perfect time to actually relook at that.
So, not dropping the ball on that, Dr. Levine, might I suggest that there be some kind of a time frame by which staff brings back to at least to me and to Dr. Bishop, the time frame for when this is going to roll out, because it's now at least a month since the meeting, 2 months.
Okay, great.
So can we not just create within enforcement a unit dedicated to addressing the problem of overprescribing, and cures would be part of that unit? We should have the resources, since we're dedicating a certain number of investigators towards those efforts anyway, so there's no reason not to create a focused unit within enforcement looking at overprescribing and addressing those problems.
Is that feasible?
Honestly, right now, I don't think it is. We don't have enough staff. If we had adequate staffing, we have a lot of new staff, because it would, geographically, the way we're set up, Dr. Lowe, if you pulled, for example, you had a 6-person team, and you completely, take all the investigators, because there are 6 in each office, from Sacramento, then you're completely, taking those investigators out of play for the other types of cases for that office. So if you took 2 from each office, for example, in Northern California, somebody from San Jose, an office in Pleasant Hill, an office in Sacramento, I just think logistically it would be difficult, to be honest, to try that right now with existing.
So perhaps for the next enforcement committee meeting, if you could work through with staff what it would take to create a dedicated, in terms of resources, training, expense, whatever, to create a dedicated unit within the investigative unit and enforcement to actually address the problem. And clearly, as part of that, a revamped cures that you had confidence in the data would be an essential piece of that, and that hopefully will be in process soon, though not
hopefully,
complete.
but again, the cures database is actually managed by Justice. We have no access to programming it or playing with it, so that is a challenge because of the way where it's currently placed.
So collaboration with Justice around achieving the goal. It's certainly a shared goal.
It seems to me that it's going to take some time for the funding, take some time for the IT to work on, some time, I don't know how much time, but I think meanwhile, what we can utilize is help from the health plan. I don't know what percent of patients who take this pain medication pay out of their own pocket, but I assume most of them probably under some kind of HMO, PPO, even health, Medicare, managed care, Medicare managed care. They all have their pharmacy management program. They track all because they pay for it, so they would know. That would be a great source that you can work with those health plans to get those data to see whether the patient or doctor overprescribing, overutilizing.
That's a great idea, Dr. Yip, and that's one of the things DEA is doing.
Dr. Gnanadev.
Madam Chair, this is an important issue, and not only on the enforcement side, but also on the prevention side. If we can prevent certain drug overdose-related deaths, whether of the people who take them or people who take them and kill others in an accident, I think it does make a difference. So that's why I make a motion that staff present at the next board meeting. What does it take to create a special investigative unit on the prescription drug overdose, and how can we work the other agencies on the cures database, availability, signing up, and so on.
Do you envision units in Northern and Southern California, or are you just envisioning one unit?
I would like the staff to really come back what it is feasible from the staff's perspective on what the resources needed.
Okay.
Madam Chair, can we entertain a second so we can discuss the motion?
Second.
Madam Chair, on the motion, I think it's good to give that specific direction, and I think it's moving in a positive way. But I think if the maker of the motion would consider, I'd like to maybe expand it just a little bit, because I think giving real clear specifics may help the staff in this process. I think that there's a large universe of stakeholders that need to participate at any type of new program or augmentation of a program, so there's not only collaboration and a look at best practices, but understanding how the law enforcement side of this and the prosecution side of this can all work together to make sure they have the tools that they need, and clearly so we can address the immediacy of this, but do so in a lasting way. So I think along the lines of the motion, if we said specifically if they would provide, as both the maker and the chair referenced, a work plan, a budget, a schedule, a list of the other stakeholders who need to be engaged by way of what recommendations and steps they see or need, and maybe if we could also take a look at what suggestions or recommendations come from other states by way of best practices. Has there been any similar programmatic changes or reforms done to address specifically those issues? And then in as much as that's concurrent, that outreach is going on, that program's coming forward, this work in progress then coming back to the board by way of this is where we are, how we go about inviting some of those stakeholders in to communicate with us and be a part of the record, as then we look forward to adopting a program that then has those pieces in place, with the understanding that there was a process we went through to reach out for justice, to reach out for the DEA, to reach out for the medical association and others who are going to want to opine and make sure that whatever it is that we're going to be doing is done in a balanced but effective way. So that was my kind of friendly amendment to the motion.
It's a long, friendly amendment. But it's
well, sometimes brevity doesn't get it done. And so I just want to make sure that we're thorough in that regard, and I apologize if it was a little long-winded. I've used up my speaking time.
I'm fine with it because that's what all I expected anyway, because that's why I want the staff to really think and see what you're making recommendations to the board. So I think just ignore everything else. Just look at a vision and see how can we do it. That's what all those things fit in. I'm fine with it.
I do need to caution the board that the way the agenda is written, it's written as status updates on action items. It's not clear on all these items that there's going to be action taken. So the board can decide to take an action, but with a motion, but
through the chair and respectful legal counsel, I think the goal here was trying to highlight the importance of this issue of wanting to have a more concrete report that would then make some recommendations on potential actions. And if it was to be agendized, even with those actions that move us towards this adoption, I think what I'm hearing and sensing from the board is a consensus that there needs to be some more urgency specific to how we can address this problem. And I think the first thing we need to identify is that we're part of the solution. The full breadth of the solution does not sit on the Medical Board of California, and we need to reach out for those stakeholders with our staff hand in hand and start that dialogue. And I think doing that puts us on the path towards solving the problem.
And that will include a budget and feasibility piece also.
Madam President, as counsel, outgoing counsel of the board, I would respectfully suggest that you can do this without a motion. Since you're in fact directing your own staff to prepare a report for consideration of the board, I don't think you can do a motion. I think Ms. Webb, if it was going external, as we call it, Ms. Webb would be exactly correct. But since you're essentially guiding your own staff on what to present, I believe you can do this without objection. You can just ask the staff prepare the voluminous and comprehensive report you seek and have that ready for consideration by the board at the next available opportunity.
Point of clarification. Could we then, as we're just directing staff and not taking an action today or making a motion on it today, ask it to be agendized then for action so the board could then affirm and adopt steps that would be concrete associated with action and time? So it's properly agendized and noticed?
So you're saying at a subsequent meeting that it be agendized as an action item?
That's requested that be calendared as such, so there can be acceptance of the report and it agendized to where we can adopt action by way of providing specific direction with timetables as well as steps to be taken.
Absolutely, Mr. Tagami. I think when we get to agenda item number 9, future agenda items, I have a note that we'll certainly request that the board put the agenda designated as an action item for the next meeting.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate Mr. Tagami's ambitious plans. I think we need to be also very realistic about what we as the medical board alone can do quickly and effectively and what our obligation is to the public, and that is protection from not good doctors. And so I don't think we should be bogged down by trying to get everybody else involved. I think we should look specifically at what our role is in terms of trying to deal with this particular problem of overprescribing. I don't know, that's just my personal perspective. I think when you try to make it too all-encompassing, that it's very hard to get something done quickly. And this is an urgent problem. We need to get something done quickly. We need to look at what we can muster in terms of resources, and I think we should try to get something done quickly.
I would also like to suggest that the opportunity for the task force to meet prior to the next board meeting with staff's involvement and engagement can be a good vehicle to start this conversation moving forward. So I know that we have a meeting in July, so let's at least commit to a interim meeting, if not before the July meeting, but after the July meeting if necessary, so that we can, it's going to take some time, and we want to do it right. And the mood of the board is unanimous, and I think staff has heard us well, but I think that we need to also expect to participate and look forward to people being available.
Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I don't care or mind if it needs to be a motion, no motion, as long as it is done. I think this is an urgent matter. I think we can do both what Dr. Lowe is suggesting and Mr. Tagami. Immediate need is an urgent action by what medical board can do. And the future broad need is what Mr. Tagami suggested. I think we should be looking at both. This is an important issue. That's what we need to remember. Number 2 is, more than just the discipline, how can we prevent? Keep that in mind. As a physician, first thing which comes to my mind is, how can I prevent something? So that's the one you got to keep in mind. So with that in mind, give us what your recommendations are.
Okay.
Okay. I have comment slips from, any other comments from the board members? If not, members of the public who'd like to speak on Ms. Sweet's report? If not, we'll move. If not, we'll move on to our next agenda item under 8A, which is Ms. Kirkmeyer and Ms. Threadgill are going to be reporting on SB 304. And this is the agenda item, the specific amendment in SB 304 that we learned about actually in the moment at our last board meeting, a proposal to move the medical board investigative staff from the medical board to the Department of Justice. And we asked for a report back at this time in terms of the ramifications for the medical board for this proposed amendment, both from a fiscal perspective as well as from the operations of the medical board, and for public accountability, our accountability to the public for oversight of investigations.
Good afternoon. As stated by Ms. Simoes at the last meeting, SB 304 was amended to transfer all of the investigative staff to the Department of Justice. If you turn to page 8A41, you will see the specific language. On this same page, through page 8A43, you will see the information that we've provided on the costs and ramifications of the transfer of these positions to the Department of Justice. Speaking in regards to the costs first, the board is projecting the cost of this transfer to be approximately $1.3 million. These costs are related to the reclassification of the investigators into DOJ classifications. Attachment 1 actually provides the specific breakdown for those costs. These costs actually do not include salaries, but do include the include salaries, but do not include the benefits. In order to see the impact to the board, we have provided a fund condition on attachment 2 on page 8A45. I would like to point out that this fund condition does include future costs for the CURES program. I believe that an email was sent out to the board members indicating that there's a budget bill currently out there to request funding for the CURES program. It's in this upcoming fiscal years. You'll see that that's in there. It also includes the increase that was approved at the last board meeting for the increase in expert reviewer pay, anticipated breeze costs, a proposal for Northern Operation Safe Medicine Unit, and other additional enforcement staff. These proposed future costs have not been approved but are going through the review process. However, it is important to know that this impact the impact of this transfer based upon these projected figures. Attachment 3 on 8A46 shows the same fund condition with a projected $2 million reversion this year, which with vacant positions and other savings, that's what we're projecting. We will revert. At the July board meeting, we'll have a more accurate picture of this actual reversion. Now that I've explained the costs, are there any questions on that portion of the report?
What does reversion mean?
Reversion is unspent money at the end of the fiscal year that is in our budget.
And what happens to that money?
It goes back into our fund.
So it's like a carry forward?
It doesn't carry forward. It goes back into our fund, and then our budget is built the next year. It has no impact on that budget for that next year.
Madam Chair, I just need one information, that is, how does this compare to what we passed the last board meeting to increase the salaries for the investigators, are the ones in the enforcement division? So what's the difference between the two amounts?
At the last, go ahead.
Well, actually, that if the investigators go over to justice, those actions would be mooted out.
I understand that. I'm just trying to see the difference between the cost, where if we just do what we passed at the last board meeting and not transferring the investigators to the versus transferring the investigators to the AG's office. What's the cost difference between the two?
What's the net increase?
Right. I'd have to get that figure for you, but I would venture to say that it will be quite a few $1,000s less.
Because at the last meeting, we didn't vote to increase their pay. It was actually a vote to give them certain benefits depending on geographical pay and field training officer pay.
Right.
So
we were
those would
talking
only
about-
impact certain individuals that fit into that criteria, as this really impacts every investigator.
Right.
I got that, Madam Chair. Just not to drag this on, but my understanding is that we will have a budget on that at this meeting. That is, what's the cost going to be to do what we recommended? That's why I'm trying to see the budget-wise, what's the difference between the two?
We can provide that to you at the July meeting.
Ms. Yaroslavsky.
So my understanding from reading this analysis of the fund condition is that it's not such a major deal. But on the other hand, my concern is this, is that the money that we are going to spend on investigators, by moving them to either DOJ or maintaining them, is that the money also follows the investigators. That we lose the money in our fund once they move.
We don't lose the money in our fund.
But
and
we don't lose it, we spend it, it's gone, it's spent.
It goes over, it'll move from salary and wages into OE&E, operating and expenses, at the bottom of your part of your budget. And that will go then to the Attorney General's office. It'll become an Attorney General line item is what it will become for investigative costs.
Right, so my concern is, that's exactly my concern. Currently, we spend approximately $1 million a month with the Attorney General's office. So now we're going to spend $1 million plus the cost of moving the investigators. And we're not saving, it's not saving, we're spending that money. So the determinant factor is, the reason you would move people is because there's some benefit to the organization. We're going to still pay for them regardless of where they are. So is the benefit for them to be, and is there room for that discussion at any point, or this is the way it is?
What we asked for was a better understanding of the implications. In July, we will, during our review of legislation, we have to take a position on SB 304.
Right. So
this was to inform that decision, which we will not be making today. We're not voting on the legislation or the amendment today.
I understand that we're not doing that. My concern is that time is passing, and what's going to happen is going to happen, and it would be nice if we could be at the party, at the table. And I'm just concerned that as we've got all the financial and the fiscal information in front of us, and I understand that we're not discussing legislation. I just want to make sure that some implication of what it's going to, how it's going to affect this board and how we're able to do our job will be part and parcel of the discussion, and we're not going to lose.
That's the intent today.
I just make sure. Okay.
That this is to go beyond just the fiscal analysis.
Thank you.
But to begin with, to understand the financial analysis, and you're right that we'll be spending the money whether they go or stay. One of the issues is that because the request to increase the investigator pay to match that of investigators in the DOJ has been denied, the irony is that we will be spending more for the same staff because of the move.
That was my point, and thank you for making it. But now, what do we do?
I think we let Kim finish her report.
Thank you.
So, thank you. The following items we believe are certain ramifications, which we're very certain, and even in discussion with the Attorney General's office. So, as I stated, the funding for these positions would be removed from the salary and wages and moved to the Attorney General's line item. The operating expenses in the board's budget associated with the current investigator positions would be reduced for all overhead costs, including equipment, vehicle maintenance, rent, travel, etc., again, and moved to the Attorney General line item. Now, the Attorney General would actually have the ability to determine its billing methodology and bill the board at an hourly rate for investigative services. Currently, we do this because we do investigations for other agencies, and we currently bill $149 per hour to those other agencies, and this is actually even for our investigative costs for physician and surgeon cases when we present that at criminal court. That's what we would try to obtain back. The investigative staff in the Operation Safe Medicine will not be transferred to the DOJ due to the fact they do criminal investigations. And if you look on page A847, We've tried to identify the positions that would move based on what we know for certain. And you'll see all of the items in red there. We believe all of those would move to the Attorney General's office. The purple, those are items that would remain in the medical board with the black, and then the green actually were in discussion as to which of those positions would move over to the Attorney General's office. So all other staff in the enforcement unit would remain at the board. For example, the Central Complaint Unit, the Discipline Coordination Unit, Probation Unit, Non-Sworn Special Investigative Unit, and the Central File. Operation Safe Medicine would actually stay with the medical board because they do criminal investigations. The board would need to have an individual designated to review investigation reports to ensure that the appropriate action was taken. For example, the closure of a case or the referral for filing. And it's really important that this, we would have to have more discussion on what this individual would do. Settlement authority would still remain with the board, and we would have that in-house. It wouldn't be with the investigator. It would remain with medical board. The investigators would be provided increased authority under their status in Penal Code Section 830.1, which will allow them to work more efficiently in their cases, specifically prescribing practices in sexual misconduct cases. So those are all the ramifications that we know for sure. There are some that we're uncertain of, and again, it goes to that disbursements of the Office of Standards and Training Unit, which I discussed earlier. Some of those staff would have to remain behind, again, because we do have Operation Safe Medicine Unit, so we would need training for them, and a non-sworn special investigator positions. It's uncertain whether the boards who utilize the medical board's investigators to perform investigations, so example, the Board of Podiatric Medicine, Osteopathic Medical Board, Physician Assistant Board, Board of Psychology, if they would continue to use the transferred investigators or whether they would use the Department of Consumer Affairs Division of Investigation. Currently, the Board of Podiatric Medicine utilizes vertical enforcement model, so they may choose to continue with the AG doing their investigations. It is uncertain whether DOJ would pay for the expert opinion reviews. In further discussion, we believe that the expert reviewer program would remain with the medical board, and we would just liaison with the Attorney General's office and their investigators. Once the board hits the financial threshold for hours that could be paid to the Attorney General's office from that line item, the board would actually have to halt investigations until July 1st of the next fiscal year. Sometimes this happens with boards that currently the medical board does investigations for, and it also happens for those that use the Division of Investigations, so that's something we would have to be aware of as a board. That could happen. What other positions the DOJ may determine are required to implement this new responsibility and the cost of those positions, we don't know what the AG's office has put forward. And if this could, the other real uncertainty is if this could actually happen by January 1st of 2014. That's only 3 months about after the bill would be signed, and that's really the first time we'd know for certain that this was going to occur. So all of those items would need to be discussed obviously with the Department of Justice and then with those other healing arts boards who use our current services. We've gathered information from other states and from the Federation of State Medical Boards. That's also in your packet on Attachment 5, 8A48. It identifies who employs investigators in other states. You'll see there that of the 12 boards that responded, 9 used their own in-house investigators. And then Attachment 6 provides information from the Federation indicating which boards have authority over disciplinary investigations. And lastly, we wanted just to provide you in our packet again the list of pros and cons. I know it was quickly put together at the last meeting, but we thought it would be helpful just so you remember what we had kind of put together at the last meeting when we first heard about SB 304. So those are the ramifications that we've looked at as staff and in discussion with the Attorney General's Office Limited.
Dr. Lowe.
So I'm kind of a simpleton, and I'm just trying to understand this a little bit better. To me, the investigators are like policemen and detectives. And the AG's office is like the DA's office. So they're separate, and they're separate for a good reason. And if we move those people into the DA's office, I mean, are we still going to get the same degree of scrutiny that we would get when they're separate? And that's my main concern. I think budget is one big, is not a big deal. It probably shouldn't have a lot of additional costs. But the concept of the medical board being responsible for investigating complaints, to me, is better done by the medical board. I just don't understand, other than trying to shorten everything and make it more efficient, but the end goal is still public protection. It's not what's fastest, it's what's best for the public. And is it best to move it in under one unit? I just don't understand it.
Mr. Serrano-Sewell.
Thank you. To Dr. Lowe's point, and to me, that's the sort of the crucial issue is, for me, the budget, that could all be worked out. Should this proceed, I do think we need to have a very clear memorandum of understanding between the two agencies that memorializes what's in law and delineates responsibilities in any gray area, just as you're sort of doing right now in preparation should that event happen. But the large public policy question, and it's being decided by the legislature and the governor, is, for me, the loss of public oversight. For better or worse, this board has jurisdiction over its investigators, and we, through that, establish priorities. We do. And should those function, very important function, be transferred to another independently elected office, I think we have to be honest and appreciate that that oversight from this board will end. And that's just the way it's going to be. And so when the public takes issue with priorities and who's responsible, and that the Attorney General's office will really have to be brought into the discussion, and they would have to decide, that office would have to decide independently how they want to interact with the public. Because it really shouldn't be through this board, should this happen, because those investigators will be employees of the Attorney General. And so if people are okay with that and understand what that means sort of on a day-to-day level, I suppose it's fine. But the petitioning and aspect of coming to this board to talk about investigations and priorities, that dialogue would have to shift significantly.
So I have two questions. One, who would set I'm assuming that the medical board would continue to set the priorities for the investigations.
Well, even if so, we're not managing them. Right?
Right, but we are paying for their services.
I understand that. That would be the give and take. Every budget cycle, and we would ask questions and do that dance. But at the end of the day, they report to an Attorney General supervisor, not this board.
So, and the second, you just said something, Ms. Kirkmeyer, that kind of raised my eyebrows, which is if they run out of money, they stop investigating?
So currently with other boards, you have, obviously this is going to go into a set Attorney General line item amount. If we got a large case that expended a lot of time in January and it took up a lot of that money, and come May 31st, and we no longer had money in our Attorney General line item to cover those costs, if we didn't have money in other places within our budget to pick up that amount of money, we would actually have to ask them to stop investigating our cases. This does happen with other boards within the Department of Consumer Affairs. I don't know if anyone here can speak to that, but that does happen with those boards, with the Division of Investigation. One thing that I can say is that we're very uncertain as to that amount of money and when it goes over, because we've had several investigative positions vacant. So we've never had to deal with that issue with having everybody full and everything. But again, even right now with the Attorney General, if we came up with what we have right now, if we ever came up to our quota with them of what we have, even prosecution, we would actually have to have them not prosecute our cases because we wouldn't have money in our budget for that year unless we could have it in other areas or unless we were able to increase our AG line item.
But because it's currently within the medical board budget, you can shift monies around. And that is not a problem? Is that what you're saying? I'm trying to understand.
Right now, we have vacancies.
Yeah, we haven't
so
had to because
if we have vacancies, that
Yeah.
That makes up that money. See, all of that money for all of the positions that we have would go to the Attorney General's office. And it's in that line item. So if they overexpended because they spent more time and money on the cases, then we would be at the breaking point for us there. But again, that's uncertain. That's one of those uncertainties that we don't know if that would happen.
Assume we had filled every position, there were no vacancies. Is there a difference between the investigators being in the medical board versus being as part of the attorney? I'm trying to understand in an apples to apples comparison. For me, the question comes down to, are we achieving something more than rearranging deck chairs?
It depends on if the Attorney General keeps with the same amount of money per hour that we currently have.
And, okay.
So I heard very carefully what Dr. Lowe and Mr. Serrano-Sewell alluded to, and I was more than concerned by what I've heard. My issue is when we hear from the public or when we hear from the media, which is another figment of the public, to call into question, how are we going to be able to hold accountable another public entity? And I have, if we could hold another public entity accountable, couldn't we then automatically fix our timelines today? And I'm not so sure the answer to that question is yes. So my biggest concern is having the fox, and no offense to the poultry business, but the fox guarding the hen house. I really heard what both of you brought to my attention. I want to thank you for that, because I think that having the separation of powers is an important reason for public protection. So I'm very concerned with this, that it's just rearranging deck chairs.
Dr. Gnanaga.
Madam Chair, I have the same concerns. I know the reason why it's being done. And if we need to clean up our act, we do need to clean up our act. But the idea of putting them in a separate public entity which is separately independently elected without board having much control, it doesn't make sense to me. We are obligated, almost all of us are volunteering, basically to do two things. Number one, protect the public. Number two, make the profession of medicine safe. That's it. That's our job. And if we are doing that job, we are supposed to do the job, taking all this time, what are these? I mean, this doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it just, if we have a problem, tell us. We'll clean up, and we are. We're actually working to see what we can do to really make it work better, rather than the drastic solution, which I think I agree with Mr. Serrano-Sewell, which is, I think, it's like transferring the police to the DA's office, which is scary.
Madam Chair.
Dr. Lowe, okay.
Mr. Takami, then
I
Dr.
think
Bishop.
Dr. Bishop was in the queue.
Dr.
I'll go
Bishop.
after him. Please.
Well, I think the drastic action being taken is in response to this board's unresponsiveness to the concerns of the legislature. So I think we really have to show a will to make some changes, to do what's right, to protect the public. Up to this point, I think I have to agree with the legislature that we have not done a good job at that. And I think that that if we can come up with a way that we can demonstrate to the public and the legislature that we can clean up our own house and proceed effectively, then I think it's probably in our best interest in the public to keep the investigators on our side. But if we're unable to do that, I think it's going to be a forced hand.
Mr. Takami.
I appreciate all the dialogue, and I think that this body, from what I'm learning, has been wrestling with this for a little while. I think it's important to underscore, I'm approaching this with the beginner's mind, so the possibilities are infinite, and it's only the expert that sees the limitation. And in doing that, just with the data that I've been given thus far, the medical board has a pretty good closure rate on complaints and cases. And the question that's really before us is how this government and a lot of the different parts of this government evolve to deal with new circumstances and new behaviors that are coming out of the public and in some cases out of practicing doctors. And the best practices question, I think, is an important one that needs to be understood. And working as a team internal to this is an important part of the solution. So I think ultimately I would be a supporter of keeping the investigative unit in the medical board for a lot of reasons. I think there are unintended consequences with that division. I think the steps to address these new concerns that have been evolving and coming to light by the legislature, by members of the public, by the media, are all things that can be addressed in a very constructive and responsible way by this body. And I think the steps to address that have been initiated, and I think understanding that this is a time really, I think, to come together and that collaboration, not only internally and really specifically respecting Dr. Lowe's comments earlier, I think there has to be two tracks. I think there has to be an immediate set of actions demonstrating the seriousness and get this moving. But at the same time, we need to look for that outreach. We need to work with our legislative staff. We need to do the communication with the legislature, with the governor's office, with the public to address concerns, mend fences if they need to be mended, and then, again, move forward in a lasting and sustainable way. So I think that we can really have both. I don't think that's overly ambitious, but I think we need to realize that there are a lot of good, hardworking folks who are really meeting the licensing and enforcement activities for this body every day, and we're literally addressing a group of individuals who are smart, who show up every day planning to find a way to circumvent the system and break the law. And so we need to give our team the support to realize that we need to suit up and address this new group of individuals who are looking constructively for ways to evade and avoid capture. And so we have to have a team approach to get it done. I think we can do that.
We call it violate the Medical Practice Act.
There you go. Well, ignorance is curable, so consider me cured, doctor.
And I make house calls, too.
Thank you.
Dr. Yip.
I kind of wait until the last to comment. I'm still trying to get my thought of all this logistic. Being, again, say my new board member here, the train has started, and the question is that how do we get the train stopped, make it good for the public? I'm not sure exactly how the legislature is going to do, who's going to make the decision, and move the unit. But I also learned we have this vertical enforcement program. We're working closely with the AG office all the time. It kind of dawned on me last board meeting what happened, why they want to create separate movement while we're working with them all the time. Now, was there any conversation from the board or from the executive staff or the medical board with the Attorney General office, exactly what this all, how it's going to work out? What is the perspective? Did they gung-ho about it? Did they actually say, hey, why don't you guys do it? Let's do it together, make it better, make it work better. Where are we now?
So I believe if I can reconstruct the history to answer your question, in 2005 there was a piece of legislation, and there are people in the audience who are more knowledgeable than I am, to actually, as part of vertical enforcement, to move the investigative unit to the Department of Justice. When that bill was finally signed by the governor, it was signed without that piece. So vertical enforcement was created. The investigative unit stayed within the medical board. And if you may remember at our April meeting, we first heard the morning of the meeting that one of the amendments to SB 304, which came from, I believe, Senate B&P staff, was to insert into the bill, into SB 304, an amendment to again move to move the investigative unit to the Department of Justice. So our staff had not had time, we had not time to consider the implications, and the amendment remains in SB 304 before the end of session, or at our July meeting. Our plan is during our review of legislation to take a position on SB 304 and in specific that amendment. So That's the origin of it. It came from Senate BMP staff, and they reached back into a piece of legislation in 2005. We do have comments from members of the public, which I think will give us more the other side of the story, if you will, about those who were there then and who have, I suspect, a different perspective than we've heard expressed so far. Are there any other comments from members of the board? If not, I'm going to call on members of the public and start with Mr. Dave Thornton, whom I've never had the pleasure to meet, but served this medical board as executive officer in the past.
Thank you, Dr. Levine. I think it's important for me to kind of give you a little bit of background of myself so you'll know my perspective and where I'm coming from with this. I started doing investigations for the medical board in 1975, a long time ago. And I worked my way up through the ranks as an investigator, supervisor, field office supervisor, deputy chief. In 2000, I was promoted to the board's chief of enforcement, and I held that position for about 3.5 years. In 2004, I was appointed as the board's executive director and served in that position until August of 2007, when I retired from state service. There's a lot of ground to cover, and I'm not sure I can do it in in 3 minutes. The issue of transferring the investigators is one that does date back to SB 231 Figaro in 2005. There were a number of provisions in that bill, and that was the board's sunset bill in 2005, which I might add the board voted unanimously to approve the transfer of the investigative staff back then. Unfortunately, at the last minute, the transfer was pulled out. But what wasn't pulled out was the transfer of the authority for investigations. You no longer have the authority for investigations. That's been transferred to the Department of Justice. When that transfer of authority happened, there were DOJ didn't have any investigators. So there's been conflict. At least there was during the time I was here. There's conflict between investigative staff and Department of Justice staff in some areas of the state, which makes things somewhat inefficient. Dr. Lowe, I appreciate your perspective on transferring the police to the DA's office, but this is a model that has worked in DA's offices throughout the state, where you do have DA investigators, and also within the Department of Justice is a model similar to what we're talking about here, and that's the Medi-Cal fraud unit, where you have DOJ agents working with the prosecutors on Medi-Cal fraud issues. Sum it up already?
No, you're yellow. Go ahead.
Okay. So what's the benefit? What is the benefit of transferring these investigators? You have a retention problem. The medical board has always had a problem of retaining its investigative staff. Investigators, it takes 2 to 3 years to fully train an investigator so they can handle a caseload. Then they're recruited by other state agencies that maybe have a lighter caseload or other issues that they're dealing with. So those investigators go to another agency. That caseload is then transferred to another investigator, and it probably goes to the bottom of the pile. I think by transferring these investigators over to DOJ, you solve that problem. You won't have a retention problem with the investigative staff at DOJ, because the salary differential is considerable. I understand that you're concerned about loss of control. You won't lose control. You still have control over which cases go for investigations. You still have control over the cases where an accusation is filed. You still have control as a board over decisions that come to you, stipulated decisions or proposed decisions. So you do not lose control. loss of the investigative staff, in my mind, and back in 2005, did not equate to loss of control nor abdication of your responsibility for public protection. In my belief, it would enhance that. I think that pretty well covers all the issues that I wanted to cover, but
Just one clarification. You said authority over investigations was transferred, but the investigators were not. What does that mean?
The government code section, in the government code, and I don't remember the code section specifically, but it gave the authority for investigations to the Department of Justice Health Quality Enforcement section. But it didn't give them any investigators.
Got it. Thank you.
It's like under the direction of and super, it's not, there was some additional language added later, whatever.
Can't hear you, Mr. Sarasso.
Any questions?
I have one. You mentioned about the salary differential. So why not pay the medical board investigators in the medical board same as the AG's office? Why should that difference be there? And if that is the reason why you think it works, I'm still not convinced that this board will not have the same authority. That's what my feeling. So I just want to know why.
Every board has agreed with that we should just pay our investigators more. Unfortunately, you can't just do that. You have to go through the Department of Personnel Administration, and they have always been reluctant to upgrade one set of investigators' salary. Because their position is that if we give it to one set of investigators at the medical board, then alcoholic beverage control is going to want it, DMV investigators are going to want it. So their position in the past, over at least 20 to 30 years that I'm aware of, has always been, no, this is the salary level. And they've really balanced it out between all the other agencies.
Ms. Yaroslavsky?
So I can appreciate all this input, and I do appreciate it. But I have a question. If it is that there isn't really a problem perceived by having them co-locate, that the problem then boils down to the salary, and we're going to be paying that salary, period, regardless of where they are. And it is state service that only allows you to have that job with that job title in that entity. Why is it then that DOJ can pay their investigators more than we can pay them? It's not a question of different boards paying different amounts. It's that the same investigator doing the same job in the same location, regardless of under what auspices, the title should be and the salary should be commensurate.
There's a different civil service classification at DOJ, and that's a special agent, and the salary level has been set for those people in that classification. Now, during discussions in 2005 with the Department of Justice, we were assured that the investigative staff would be moved over and be moved over at the special agent classification, which would solve the salary problem. But you're right. I mean, the only difference is that classification, which the Department of Justice has exclusively.
So my understanding is that we get investigators. It's very hard for us to get them. They're a very specialized class of individual. They study hard. They work hard. They have to go through background checks. There's all sorts of hoops they have to jump through. And then they jump through all of them. It takes months. So what I like is some historical perspective of now they've gone through the hoops. Now they can leave and go to other law enforcement entities in different boards and bureaus throughout the state, get paid more money for doing less work, and we've done the training, and we're losing the benefit of time and money as well. Is that something that was ever addressed on a statewide under your memory?
We tried to address that problem by looking at pay differential for different areas of the state, and I think that you're revisiting that prospect now. But we can only pay what the state allows us to pay in that particular classification. And again, the board has tried in the past to increase the salary level just if it's investigators, because I believe that there is a provision in the B&P code, as I recall, that allows the board to set the salary level. But realistically, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen that way because of the civil service system.
So I'm still not clear as to why the title might be different and the job is the same and the pay scale is allowed to be different.
That's a good question, but that's just the reality. If you're in the Department of Justice and you're under the civil service classification of a special agent, then your pay is higher. It's about $20,000 a year higher.
Thank you.
See, I believe that that's a problem, and I think that we have reasonable minds and that the problem should be fixed rather than to move somebody over to a different area. And when you refer to the fact that some DA offices have investigators, those DA offices have not done away with the police department and the detectives.
Correct.
They function in a totally different role. Furthermore, we have an ambitious plan to educate and upgrade our own investigators through a program very much like our expert reviewer training program, which you may not be familiar with, but it's been very successful, and we plan to do that with our investigators. And I don't believe that the AG's office has those resources. They just won't be able to have the expertise in medicine to give the investigators the knowledge that we can impart on them.
Well, that depends on how the transfer of the staff occurs. And I know that you talked about the unit that does standards and training. There are peace officers in that unit. That unit, during the time I was here, provided specialized training for the investigative staff, Dr. Lowe, and I don't know that wouldn't continue.
But we're talking about medicine. They don't have that medical background and knowledge that we can impart upon them with our consultants and experts.
You would still have, and I don't know what the current plan was, but the plan was to transfer not only the investigative staff, but the field office medical consultants and the field office non-sworn staff.
I don't think that's true. My understanding that is not true. Is that true or not?
The way the language in the bill reads,
the consultants don't go.
No, it says that, and their staff, and the consultants are staff of the essential staff, I might add, of the enforcement program.
I think you're at a place to opine on what happened before.
Right.
And that's the benefit of your testimony now and your statements, which I found helpful. But sort of perspective, that's for this board to deal with. Thank you for your comments.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Dicami.
One, just a point of clarification through staff. Is there statistics on what our leakage or attrition rate is amongst investigators?
Termination rate, turnover rates, rather.
Yeah.
Yes, I can dig those statistics out for you. We've done multiple studies with the retention having been the focus over many years, and I can pull out some of that history for you.
Just a eyeball or annual
as
turnover
recent
rate.
as I want to say fall of 2012 or 11, we were right at the 20% vacancy rate. We were approaching it.
Annual turnover. So in other words,
I'm trying to go backwards into it. I'm sorry. Annually, we were losing about 20 over the last since 2005, we've had 20 transfers and 20 retirements. That's loss of 40 investigators. That's like almost half of our entire unit over those over the last 8 years.
So through the chair, then for clarification, but half of that is retirement.
Yes.
Right, and then the rest of it, you said just attributed to transfers, meaning transferring to other units.
Right.
And then, so just as a follow-up, and you don't have to answer it today, but if that information is, what the average tenure is, and then it'd be interesting to understand how that stacks up against other law enforcement. Just to have that information as it relates to the relevance of that for that decision-making could be helpful.
Okay.
Were there other speakers, Madam Chair?
Yes. Ms. D'Angelo Felmuth.
Good afternoon, Dr. Levine and board members. My name is Julie D'Angelo Felmuth. I'm the Administrative Director of the Center for Public Interest Law, and I'm the former Medical Board Enforcement Monitor from 2003 to 2005. We strongly support the provision in SB 304 that would transfer this board's investigators into the Attorney General's office and specifically into its health quality enforcement section, which has specialized in cases against physicians for over 20 years. Mr. Thornton is correct. Right now, today, and for the past 7 years, the health quality enforcement section of the AG's office has been responsible for both the investigation and the prosecution of cases against physicians. And they must use vertical enforcement. Vertical enforcement is widely used by law enforcement agencies all over the country, state, federal, local law enforcement agencies that investigate and prosecute complex cases like medical board cases. DA's offices and police departments can separately investigate street crimes and other lower-level, non-complex crimes, but when it comes to complex cases like your cases, that's where vertical enforcement comes in. VE contemplates early cooperation, collaboration between the investigator and the prosecutor, and it contemplates the direction of the investigation by the prosecutor. And the ideal, most efficient, best way to implement vertical enforcement is to have both sets of folks employed by the same agency. This transfer would, at long last, finally give the AG's office, HQE, the investigative staff that they need to carry out both investigations and prosecutions. This board's role would remain unchanged. Your executive director would still have to sign off on accusations. You board members will still be reviewing proposed ALJ decisions and stipulations. That is not going to change. The transfer would have many benefits, and Mr. Thornton pointed out a few of them. Both sets of folks would be truly on the same team, governed by the same policy and protocol manual. Both sets of folks would use the same computer system, and I cannot overstate the importance of that. Right now, we not only have the inefficiency of two sets of employees entering the same data on the same cases into two separate systems, we have both sets of folks counting cases and the case cycle processing times differently. That's just an inefficient disconnect that has got to be removed. Both sets of folks would be co-located in the same city and even in the same buildings. That would lead to better communication, improved decision-making, and lower case cycle times. And last but not least, it would lead to a likely salary increase for investigators, which would solve the problem that Ms. Threadgill described in great detail at just the last meeting. She went through the last 2 decades of unsuccessful efforts by this board to do anything to increase investigator salaries and prevent these experienced, trained folks from leaving the board. That hasn't worked. This transfer would work. Investigators would stay. They would be able to work more closely with prosecutors. They would be able to see their own input and their own role, the fruits of their labor in successful cases, and they would have improved job satisfaction. You've mentioned that this provision was in a bill in 2005. It was in the bill the entire year of 2005. It had to be pulled out at the last day. This board unanimously supported that bill, as did the Department of Justice, California Medical Association, and Kaiser Permanente. 7 former board presidents wrote letters supporting the transfer provision, and I'd just like to read a few of them to give you a sense of what they thought. Karen McElliott
One minute.
was a public member who was president in 1993. She said structural reform of investigations is of paramount importance. Moving investigators into the AG's office will implement the vertical prosecution model widely used in other law enforcement agencies. It will expedite the investigation of meritorious cases and the dismissal or settlement of less serious cases. Bruce Hazenkamp, public member, president, 1994. Moving the investigators into the AG's health quality enforcement section will finally give us the sort of prosecutorial structure that elsewhere in the nation works fairly and swiftly. Lives depend on that. Tom Jose, Dr. Tom Jose, 1997 board president. The centerpiece of your legislation is its structural reform of the investigations process and the transfer, the merging of the Medical Board of California's investigators into the Attorney General's office. It is not only an old concept, it is a very functional concept.
Okay, Julie, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to give you some sense of the feeling of your predecessors, all of whom served 8 years on this board and are very familiar with your enforcement program. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Could we ask the speaker if she would make available to us those correspondence so
Of
they can be
course.
distributed to the board?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tina Manassian, did you keep going? Okay. Okay, great. Are you done with this?
I just want to point out that those things that she read aren't based on any fact that I'm aware of. I mean, they're opinions.
That's right.
They're also based on that time.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Threadgill, did you have anything else to add?
No.
All right.
I will.
Then the action or our plan will be to revisit this issue in July as we review the legislation, SB 304.
Okay, and bring back the information regarding the average tenure.
Great. Average tenure and annual turnover rate. Great. Can we proceed then to agenda item 8B, Senate Bill 1441, Ridley Thomas, and this is a proposal to incorporate the uniform standards for substance abusing licensees. We've asked Mr. Hepler to give us the process for setting a regulatory hearing and a timeline. Mr. Hepler.
Thank you, Madam President and members. First of all, good afternoon. At its most recent April meeting, the board spoke clearly and unequivocally. It told staff to essentially commence a rulemaking process to implement the SB 1441 standards. To that end, Ms. Dobbs and I have had some preliminary discussions about how best to accomplish that. We have had some fruitful discussions. We will include Ms. Webb there as the situation begins to gel. At the July board meeting, we will bring language to this board for their consideration. If it meets the board's approval, the board then at the July meeting could set the matter for public hearing. The public hearing would happen essentially contemporaneously with the October board meeting. At that time, the board would consider public comment and written comment taken during the open comment period. If it meets to the board's satisfaction, then the board could essentially close the comment period, prepare the statement of reasons, the final statement of reasons, without any adverse comments. The board would then transmit that to the department and to the various control agencies, including the Office of Administrative Law, for ultimate approval of the regulations. So we're looking at essentially, just to boil things down, at the July meeting would be the board's first look at the proposed regulations. If it meets their approval, set it for hearing to be held during the October board meeting without any adverse comments or any 15-day rulemaking. We would then close the period and then process the documents and send them to the control agencies for approval, probably to take effect sometime in 2014.
And what is that? What's the average? How long does that approval process take once it's out of your hands?
Well, we have several steps to go through. We have the department itself, we have agency, we have the Office of Administrative Law. So we're thinking probably, Kim, you can probably do, but at least 30 days through the department and agency. OAL then has 30 days to act on it after we get it that far. Finance also has a role in this obligation, so they sometimes take up to 30 days, if not longer. So once it leaves the board, we can figure on roughly about 90 days or so. So there may be changes, extraordinary circumstances, but
first quarter 2014
would be optimistic, I think, but I think doable if we proceed at full speed.
Okay, thank you very much. Board members, any comments, questions for Mr. Hepler? Any members of the public?
Thank you, members.
Okay, we're moving on to 8C, CPEI positions. And this again is follow-up from our last meeting, Ms. Threadgill and Ms. Kirkmeyer. And this is an issue that we dealt with during Sunset Review, during our preparation for the materials for Sunset Review. And is Mr. Sears here?
No.
No, okay.
All right. We would like to draw your attention to tab 8C on page 8C1. Pages 8C1 through 8C14 provide information on the CPEI positions. I'm going to provide a very brief background on these positions, and then Ms. Threadgill is going to provide the board's proposal for these positions. At the Executive Committee on January 31st, a presentation was made on these positions. Attachment 1 on page 8C4 to 5 provides the handout that was provided at that meeting. The document described the history of these positions, explained why these positions had not been filled, and explained that these positions were eliminated due to the 5% salary savings drill or budget letter 1203. The board was notified they could reestablish these positions in the blanket, and at the January meeting, we provided a proposal for reclassifying the positions. However, after that meeting, we were notified that we could not reclassify those positions. Upon this information, we went back and revived and reviewed the board's original plan when these positions were established in July and October of 2010, and have developed a plan to establish a unit for these positions. I did want to briefly describe that these positions are not in the governor's budget. If you look at the salary and wages section of the governor's budget for fiscal year 2013-14 on page 8CA, you will notice the board has 281.4 total medical board positions. 10.3 of those are temporary positions, leaving the board with 271.1 full-time perm positions. This number does not include those CPEI positions because, again, those positions were eliminated. This is the reason why these positions are not counted in the board's vacancy rate. The board can fill these positions, however, as long as it ensures that it maintains an overall salary savings of approximately $941,000 each year. This amount equates to about a 5% vacancy rate. Therefore, as long as the board maintains these vacancies and this amount, it can fill these positions. We need to remain very cognizant of this and ensure we do not expend our budget. The proposal that Ms. Threadgill will now present takes this into consideration.
The board has proposed to establish a complaint investigation unit staffed with 6 special investigator positions that are non-sworn and 1 supervising special investigator position that is also non-sworn within the enforcement program. If you will refer to the handout with the org chart on it, I don't have the, it was not in your packet, it's loose. It shows where in the enforcement program this unit would be positioned. We have identified a number of case types that can be investigated and referred for prosecution without the use of a peace officer investigator. The board is proposing to redirect the following case types to non-sworn personnel to investigate. Physicians who have been charged with or convicted of criminal offenses or reported, an arrest has been reported on their renewal application. Quality of care investigations following a medical malpractice settlement or judgment, violations of a term or condition required of a physician on probation following a disciplinary action, reports of disciplinary actions taken by another jurisdiction or state, physicians petitioning the board for reinstatement of a license following revocation or surrender, physicians petitioning for modification or early termination of probation, and outpatient settings based upon information from the accreditation agencies. Not all enforcement activities or investigative duties require the use of sworn peace officers. Many tasks associated with the investigations can be performed by non-sworn investigators, such as detecting and verifying violations, interviewing witnesses, gathering information, analyzing testimony, serving legal papers, or serving as expert witness amongst other non-sworn duties. Having non-sworn investigators will allow sworn investigators to perform investigative tasks that require a peace officer status, such as involving the use of firearms, making arrests, engaging in search and seizure activity. A simple change such as this will help shorten the time frames on the core investigative tasks by reducing the number of cases currently assigned to the board's peace officer investigators. A reduced caseload will allow the investigators to complete their investigations in a more timely manner, which is consistent with the board's strategic goals, objectives, and mission.
And I just wanted to briefly go over the time frame. It's actually on page 8C2 to 8C3, and you can see as of yesterday, we actually submitted the packages for these positions to the Department of Consumer Affairs. Because these are new positions, they do have to go through the complete approval process through the Department of Consumer Affairs Human Resources Office, as well as they do have to go to CalHR, which is the state HR, for approval. That is a lengthy process to get through them, at least 30 days usually for them to review it. But as soon as we got approval, then we would start advertising for those positions and then filling those positions at that time.
Just one question. The total that you've submitted was for 6 plus 1, so 7 positions.
That's correct.
But the CPEI positions that are in the blanket, which is like the cloud, as I understand it, is 15.5.
That's correct.
And
we really, and when we looked at this, comparing to the budget, especially with the uncertainty of what will happen with the investigators, knowing that in order to fill these positions, we do have to maintain a 5% salary savings. In addition, in order for us to justify positions, even though we have these positions, in order for us to justify them through the CalHR and even the Department of Consumer Affairs, we have to have a workload associated with them in order to justify those. This workload that we've provided is at this time what we believe is being cognizant of the budget and the workload that we can establish for the positions, what we believe at this time we should begin with. That's not to say that if the budget will support it, we wouldn't, and we see the definite need for these, we will continue that with another unit.
so you're not saying that this is all that you could use?
No, this is a starting point. Keeping in mind that we're going to have to engage in training,
Right.
hiring,
I understand.
and training. So,
Sure. I just want to be clear on that.
Yes, definitely a starting point for us.
Any questions from board members? Questions from members of the public?
Thank you, Madam President. Could I address Kim and Renee separately, since they talked about two separate issues?
It's
Or
one
do-
issue, 2 people, 1 issue.
I know, but could I address what she said and what
Sure.
she said? Okay. Tina Manassian, California patient advocate. My comments are of my own and do not reflect Consumers Union Safe Patient Project. I've been tracking the Medical Board of California for about 8 years, and I have many, many resources. Chief Threadgill proposes redirecting several types of cases to non-sworn personnel by establishing the Complaint Investigative Unit with 6 non-sworn special investigators. However, Chief Threadgill is cherry-picking information and is leading out the fact that the Medical Board of California enforcement already has non-sworn inspectors who, in addition to monitoring physicians on medical board probation, have for years done several of the cases that Chief Threadgill wants the 6 non-sworn special investigators to do. These inspectors currently work, number 1, violations of terms and conditions required of a physician on probation following a disciplinary action. 2, physicians petitioning the board for reinstatement of a license following revocation and surrender. 3, physicians petitioning the board for modification or early termination of probation. These non-sworn inspectors make about $1,500 to $2,000 less a month than both the current sworn investigators and the non-sworn special investigators proposed by the chief. See salary statistics on page 8. These inspectors initially were NBC investigator assistants. In 2007, the Medical Board Probation Unit was converted completely to non-sworn with the idea that the inspectors would handle non-sworn duties and ease the caseload for Medical Board sworn investigators. Several of the remaining non-sworn duties listed by Chief Threadgill are also worked, at least partially, by analysts and technicians in NBC Enforcement Headquarters. They are paid considerably less than sworn and non-sworn investigators. It would be cost effective to hire additional inspectors and to better utilize analysts and technicians for these non-sworn duties. I would suggest the board set this issue for a discussion at the next board meeting and request the appearance of the Sacramento manager of the MBC probation unit. This would give the board members an opportunity to explore the inspector's current duties and see how they can be utilized even more as support for investigators at a cost savings to the board. Chief Threadgill states non-sworn investigators will allow a sworn investigator to essentially devote more time to investigative tasks that require peace officer status, such as the use of firearms, making arrests, search and seizure, etc. What she's not telling the board is that the majority of the medical board's sworn investigators are administrative cases, mostly physician quality of care cases, not criminal cases requiring peace officer status. It has been the medical board's failure to work the quality of care cases in a timely manner that has endangered the public by delaying administrative action against bad doctors. MBC resources should be applied towards decreasing the amount of time it takes to work these cases, streamlining the process from beginning to end. More support, assistance, and tools are needed for the MBC investigators in the field. When investigator assistants were taken away in 2007 from the MBC district offices, the investigators, who get paid twice as much, have had to take over their jobs serving subpoenas, running criminal and civil printouts, picking up and dropping off medical and court records, etc. This increases the time it takes to work a caseload and is not cost effective. More hours for medical consultants. I'm almost done. Dave Thornton got way more time than I did.
Well, actually, he didn't. He spent all his time in questions, but go ahead.
More hours for medical consultants in the district offices are needed. That's what's really needed, is the medical consultants, since their medical opinions are needed to work the volume of quality of care cases. A cost savings to the board could be realized by converting through attrition MBC investigators from sworn to non-sworn. This would save MBC money since the retirement is less costly and the equipment and training costs would be reduced. Several state agencies utilize non-sworn investigators, such as DRE, Department of Real Estate, Department of Insurance, Contractors Licensing Board. Non-sworn investigators are not prohibited in conducting an investigation and submitting it to the DA's office for consideration of filing criminal charges. I would suggest that the board ask Chief Threadgill to provide current case statistical printouts for the Northern California MBC Enforcement District offices, Sacramento, Pleasant Hill, San Jose, Fresno, showing the following: breaking down each case by its code type, quality of care, sexual misconduct, overprescribing, fraud, etc. Provide a list of what each code means. Number of arrests made for 2010 to 11, 2011 to 12, and for 2012 to date physical.
We're really out of time.
Thank you for your consideration.
And do I have other members of the public who would like to speak on this issue? Okay. Where are we? The positions have been submitted, and we will hear at the July board meeting status of those positions. Thank you.
We'll continue to update you on it.
All right, we're going to move on to agenda item 8D, SB 100 task, and we're going to start with, is Mr. Warden here? Mr. Warden, Ms. Ingram. I have Dr. Gananadev's name by this item.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and the task force hasn't met yet, but it plans to meet before the next regularly scheduled board meeting, that is July, and look into the standards, if they need to be amended, what we need to come up with more regulations, and so on and so on. So we got a big task ahead, but as I mentioned, the plan was to give a report by July board meeting anyway. This is interim board meeting, so we instructed the staff already to arrange for the meeting for Ms. Shipsky and I to meet to look into these issues.
And Mr. Warden, it's not on here, but it was Dr. Salmonson.
Right.
Was the other chair.
Oh, Dr. Salmonson. I'm sorry, yes.
But you were going to report at this meeting on the status of the data from the accreditation agencies?
I'm going to provide you some update on that on the next, when we go to the website.
Okay.
So since our last board meeting, staff both in licensing and our ISB unit have been working on some improvements on our website, which Ms. Ingram will start showing you some of those particular things. But since the last board meeting, all the accreditation agencies have been providing us with a lot of the missing data, and we have been updating that data as we get it. It's been a lot of information, and there's been a lot of updating. It's not quite all done yet. They're also in the process of doing their accreditation renewals. So we're getting both sets of things at the same time, and we have very limited staff who have been working on that. But we have made quite a bit of progress on that, and this is sort of where we're at. When you click on our new button on the front page to the outpatient settings, you'll go to our page that you see now. And in your packet on page board 8D-133 was a draft of what we were working on, but now it's pretty much functional. And you'll see on the right-hand side we have several new links. One's for frequently asked questions regarding outpatient surgery centers. We have another one for outpatient setting complaint overview and process. We have one for the consumer complaint form, one for the consumer complaint form in Spanish, and the types of settings that are not required to be on our list. And we also included a note that if you're completing a complaint form regarding an outpatient surgery center, to also include the name of the center. That helps us. There's a box on there for that in the other box. And as we scroll down, some of the outpatient settings are accredited or certified through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Those settings are exempt from our list, and they're exempt from being accredited through our required accreditation process. However, we decided to provide the links to some of their main website and to some of their common things. In addition, we have asked that our accreditation agencies, who also do some of the certification for CMS, to provide us the names of the surgery centers that are certified through that process. We have received some of those names. We'll be receiving more. The one thing that is important to note is they're not required to have all the same information that our accreditation is. But this is a step that we are doing to make it sort of easy for our consumers to find an idea of at least where to look for if the person is, or the setting is accredited. So that's some of the information that you will not see on the accreditation for the facilities that are certified by CMS. Is going to not necessarily have the name of the owners and some of that other information, but we will have the settings name and the address of that. We'll also identify it on our website with a box that says CMS as a check mark. That box isn't quite functional yet. It's in the process. It'll be functional by the next board meeting. If not, it'll probably be functional before that. And in addition, we're working on putting our inspection reports onto the website that's in a manner that's a little easier for the consumers, and that each setting will have their individual inspection reports on their listing. That will include the inspection reports from the implementation of the law change, which has been within the last year. So it would not include past. So that's I'm going to ask Ms. Ingram to just click on some of the links so she can see how they work. And we just actually had this up and running on Monday, so or actually Friday night. So we've developed a set of list of questions, and that can be, as we come across more questions that are common to consumers, we'll be adding to that. And we are going, the complaint overview process will be there for the consumers to look at. Click on that one. And then we can go back. As you scroll down, it has just sort of an overview that was presented at the board meeting a year ago in July. And so We also have the 2 consumer complaint forms that are here on this page, not just on our home page, and so that makes it easier for people who are looking for that and they're looking for a specific thing. So that we've added that convenience for them. And then the types of settings is a listing of types of settings that aren't required. So and then there are still going to be a lot of settings that are not going to be able to be identified, even though we're asking for these certified settings from the CMS side. There's still many settings that don't meet that standard or the standard for accreditation that are out there.
So again, my understanding was that the accreditation agencies were to have submitted to you by May 31st complete data on the information that they're required to by law.
They have submitted us a whole bunch of information. It's voluminous. We have updated our website. We have not completely updated our website based on the volume that we have received. So it's not like a click of a switch. Our systems don't talk to each other. So they provide us one set of information. We have to put it into this system. It's very labor intensive. I've had 2 staff working full time since we've been getting this information, and actually our manager has been working weekends and late evenings to get to where we're at. The ISB staff has been working late and getting to this website to do these things very late. It is a huge improvement over what we previously had. And as far as what they have submitted for their accreditation renewal, we haven't even had a chance to review that information yet. So I have binders from each of the agencies that have submitted their renewal request that we have to still review. That will be the next step. We hope to have that ready for you at July, but that's once again, I only have a limited amount of people who can do that, and one of those is my manager and an AGPA who does not have this as a full-time job. So I'm taking away staff from other jobs to do this, and myself. We also have another agency who's applying for accreditation that we still need to review. So we have a lot going on in this unit, and myself, and we're working on that.
Mr. Warden, why can't you ask these agencies to submit electronically, which can be loaded onto your system rather than binders and then re-upload? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, the binders and stuff is for the renewal process, not for the information that's required for be posted on our website. There's a difference. The information they're supplying to us is electronic. However, the ones systems aren't talking to the other. This system was built quickly with limited staff due to the high volume of staff time that's being spent on Breeze. Once we get through Breeze, we'll be able to upgrade this to a better system. But until that time, we're working within our limitations.
Yeah, the ideal thing is, my example I can use is a trauma registry. It's a national data bank. And we at the trauma center provide in their format so that they can just upload without double the work or triple the work. So it takes a lot of work to transfer the information one system to the other. So we should have, and we should be forcing the agencies to submit into information which can be uploaded directly without a lot of labor.
It's not a matter
applaud that, absolutely.
It's not a matter of forcing them. It's a matter of system limitations right now.
Go ahead.
And I believe that we are working on a manner in which that the individual entities will be able to get in and enter their own information in the future. That's a step of the system that we're working with, correct, Mr. Warden?
Correct. We've already been working on that, but we do have, as I said, staff limitations at the moment. And until that gets all taken care of, we're doing with what we have, which is continuously improving this. At the same time, they're working on doing what Ms. Kurtmeyer had said, which will make it a more seamless process, but we're not there yet. And so until that happens, we are doing an incredible amount of work with a limited amount of staff, and that's where we're at. So this is, information about a bricks and mortar store. This is good physicians don't take patients to bad places. So keep that in mind.
I just want to suggest that perhaps with limited staff, if we sent the staff to task them more to getting the system able to accept stuff directly from the providers, that then their job will be much easier in the future immediately. So, I mean, I'm not sure if that's a reasonable way to go, but if you can get the system set up so the other people can do the legwork, that might be in the long run the better way.
Yeah.
And then that is something we are working on, but our ISB staff also have limited time based on Breeze, and we are doing the best we can at the moment.
And it's getting that initial information, and now that we've requested it from them, once we get that in, then that's when we'll really turn on the button to where they can do that themselves. But for now, it's really getting that initial information that they've sent to us electronically into the system. So,
Ms. Yaroslavsky, Dr. Lowe.
So what it sounds like is that we're playing catch-up, that we've asked for information, we've asked for everything to come forward and to get to us. Unfortunately, we had asked that same information previously, so it's until we catch up to the systems and the ability of the system to take in the information. We understand, Mr. Warden, the taxation on your staff and the limited number of staff and people that you have and time and hours to do this. I would venture to say, though, that as we roll this out, the most important thing is that public and consumers need to know what's going on, that there has been a real effort, a real exceptional effort, I'd say, in how to deliver this information in a timely fashion, and at the same time, it may be something to think about how this is, as you're making these improvements, is making sure we as board members are checking these links and coming to you and referring any questions or ideas or suggestions we have, as well as a myriad of consumer groups out there, as well as elected officials. My concern is that everything's going to be great on the website, and we all assume that everyone looks at the website, but I don't think that's true. Somehow it just seems to me that somehow not everybody is aware of it. So as this is going forward, I would just ask that part of a public information campaign for consumers to check the website with maybe 3 or 4 questions. You won't find the website if you're a Medicare, Medi-Cal provider, whatever those things. Somehow get this stuff out to the public is what I'm suggesting, even though it's not totally complete yet. Also, I would like to mention that Dr. Salmonson has provided a document that Dr. Ganadev, I'll make sure you have, as also wants to do some background on this. And I apologize for not bringing it to you today, Dr. Ganadev, but I was busy.
So I had just a question. You made a comment about good doctors don't take patients to bad facilities. Now, is it always the doctor's choice where they take the patient? Is it never an insurance company's contract with a particular facility that may often override what a physician wants to do?
I'm sure that could possibly happen, but ultimately the patient would also need, most surgeries that are done at outpatient surgery centers are of an elective type, and if you're having concerns about the outpatient surgery center, if I was a patient, I would be making sure I was going to the right one. And having had my own families having surgeries done recently at outpatient surgery centers, you sort of know in advance when they're elective and versus an emergency where you're going to an emergency room. It is important, but if they're accredited and they're by us, or if they're licensed by CDPH, the chances of it being a bad place are much smaller than a place that's not required to meet it, who's all of a sudden decided to beat the system and go beyond the step of doing procedures that are beyond the scope of what they're supposed to be doing.
Okay, so I'm not sure. Yeah. Thank you. So where do we stand right now with the current renewal process? When do you expect that those applications will be submitted?
The renewal documents are already submitted to us by our deadline. The staff has not reviewed those documents.
Because you're reviewing the other data dump.
Correct.
Trying to get that up on the system.
Correct.
Which I appreciate those efforts. So one of the things that became, well, a few things became clear to me at our last meeting in which we had comments from the 4 accrediting agencies is that there are across-the-board standards that the accredited agencies have to, well, a couple things. One is the board sort of has indirect authority over some certain outpatient surgery centers, that our authority is expressed through approving the accreditation of these accrediting agencies. So, and they were reviewing their submittal right now, right? Okay, so one of the comments that really stuck with me that day was from one of the accrediting agencies in which they said it was a non-negotiable item that they would only accredit outpatient surgery centers in which the physician performing a procedure had that same authority to perform that surgery at a hospital. Yeah, thank you. Acute care hospital or privileges elsewhere, or was certified in that area of practice. But not all accredited agencies require that. And it got me thinking that this process might be a good opportunity for the board to hit the pause button on the renewal process that's going on right now, or take another look at it by, I'm just putting it out there, allowing an interim approval for the existing applicants with the understanding that the board would exercise its rulemaking authority and promulgate some rules around what we expect of the accrediting associations. One of them could be a commitment on the number of unannounced visits, surprise inspections. One of them could be this physician practice issue. I'm sure there are others, but we should take this opportunity to look at our essential mission and give some serious thought to promulgating some rules around that topic.
Well, we can't tie that to the renewal.
Sure we can.
I respectfully disagree with that because
I think, Kirk, there's nothing that prohibits this board from promulgating a rule that's consistent with its mandate and mission.
If I may, there does have to be a regulation process. Because
oh, absolutely. No, it can't be done ad hoc or without adhering to the strict rulemaking APA process. I wasn't. If I gave the impression that I was suggesting otherwise, I apologize. But we would absolutely adhere to that rulemaking process.
Right. So part of
public comment, interested party meetings, all that stuff.
Some of what you're asking about and talking and suggesting about is something that Dr. Gondev and Dr. Samuelson and myself are going to be looking at in our task force to bring to the board for possible regulations. And so then we go through the regulation process to implement those, and then that would be something that the accreditation agencies would have to abide by. So that's sort of how we're going to get to where you're trying to go. And so but the actual renewal of the accreditation agencies is what it is. It's a renewal. And
you could suspend the renewal. I mean, I won't argue if we get there the same way, that's fine, Kirk. I mean, my understanding of the law is one thing, and we would defer to counsel on that fine legal point. But if through the task force, the good work of the task force, if they decide that we should engage in the rulemaking process, and if a rule is so promulgated, it would attach immediately, once it's gone through the process, to the existing accrediting agencies, that there wouldn't be the requirement that they comply with it 3 years from now. When they're up for renewal, it would be at that time.
That's the question.
Yeah, I understand that, and that would depend on regulations are different than statutes, and regulations would be, I think, can be implemented in timely, and not something that is a statute that is a little bit different. Regs, I believe, and I can be corrected by our attorneys, but are a little bit different than a statute change.
I know.
And the regulation process generally is giving further definition of a statute which would be implemented. So if you wanted more random, if you wanted to specify they need to do random inspections 4 times a year, that would be something that would become effective after the regulation took effect.
So I think
that would be more immediate if that's what you're trying to ask.
I think the question is, can the process of renewing the accreditation status be put on hold until such time and continue their current accreditation status, but defer the, and I don't know if the lawyers need to think about this, but defer the renewal until such time as we have, and it may be a year, as we have gone through an interested parties meeting, regulations, and essentially to change the accreditation status, the accreditation standards. If the board determines that it wants a consistent set of accreditation standards, not a minimum set, for example, I think what Mr. Serrano-Sewell is asking is there a way to, rather than go through the renewal and then it's 3 years before the new regulations would take hold, is there a way to suspend the renewal activity?
Maybe that question's better suited. Maybe that question's better suited to Mr. Hepler.
The regulation
give us some sort of the legal parameters.
Right,
and thank you, Sharon, for
versus a statute.
coloring that.
No,
well, we get that. We know there's a difference between statutes and regulations.
Yeah.
So if you added more specific requirements for the outpatient surgery centers to do something, then that becomes effective. Sort of like, as I used the example, if you required more inspections on a more regular basis, then they would have to comply with that.
Right.
If they're not complying with that, then that's grounds for taking a non-compliance, and you would prepare an accusation for an administrative hearing to discipline their accreditation status. But you can't really withhold anybody's renewal. There's a process. So.
What Sharon articulated really well for me, thank you, Sharon, that's why you're the president, is it wouldn't be a denial, it would be, well, Kirk heard what was said, so.
Good afternoon, Madam President, members. This is kind of a close legal call. In some respects, what you're saying is essentially you want to, Mr. Serrano-Sewell sort of used your language, hit the brakes on the renewal process, and then with the understanding, or defer it, with the understanding that there may be some upcoming regulatory developments that would put the subsequent renewal that was just deferred on a higher standard.
Yeah.
That is essentially sort of difficult because generally speaking, renewal in the licensing realm, and we're on a sort of a pure licensing realm, is more of a right. You go through and you just renew, and if it falls short of whatever the standard is, then you take administrative disciplinary action and stop that renewal cycle by taking it away. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's unusual. The second thing I think from a public policy perspective the board may want to consider is essentially by, probably a wrong term, by grandfathering or deferring the renewal. You may have a situation where the credit agency right now is, for whatever, just in a hypothetical, may be deficient in some regard that you will not catch because you have essentially grandfathered them for 12 months. I would ask the board to seriously consider whether that is in derogation of its public policy role. I think the best way, and I understand the board's palpable consumer protection concern here over the fitness and the consumer safety and public safety issues surrounded by outpatient settings. I don't want to use surgery because the law and the practice is that it's more than just surgery. It's medical procedures done when the patient is anesthetized to essentially general anesthesia, and it's also now in vitro procedures. So I would respectfully suggest one of the things the board may consider would be the things that we have in 1248.15, which is kind of leading to our third bullet item. Those are floors. Those are minimum standards. The board may want to consider ramping those up and doing it in a basis kind of like the instructions you gave staff for 1441 is don't hit the brakes, hit the gas, and hit the gas hard. And we can do that by convening interested parties meetings and interim hearings like the one we have, and teleconference meetings where we don't have to assemble, but we can discuss the regulatories that we can do in that fashion. And if you don't have to wait for the on-cycle meeting, which is the board every 90 days, you can essentially effectuate those changes more quickly than you can do the traditional on-cycle comment period that I spoke of when I spoke of earlier. So as your attorney, it's not that I'm saying no to hit the brakes and defer. I'm saying I would like to come back in July if you'll direct me to do so with sort of a risk analysis sort of a thing, if you want to go that, the board wishes to go that direction. If the board wishes to take the more traditional accelerated rulemaking, it can certainly do so. So with that, I'll be quiet and answer any questions.
Madam Chair, my understanding is that the task force job is to do all those and present to the board. So I'm taking it for granted that with Mr. Warden and Mr. Hepler, we will have this with Dr. Salmonson. We will look into all these issues, especially making the minimum requirements harder. And then the regulatory process will, how you get the regulations, then that process starts. CMS does this all the time. That's what CMS does with any reg. They put the minimum standards, then either whether it is Joint Commission or HFAB or whoever is the one who is the agency doing it on behalf of CMS, they add their own and then go for it. So that's why I think it's important for us to come up with those. That is, we need to look at CMS regulations, and we need to look at what we think are the minimum standards needed for this outpatient surgery settings. And then we will recommend to the board, and then board can instruct the staff to start the process, which is rulemaking process. What I'm thinking about renewal process is you're renewing the agency which accredits. We're not doing the accrediting of the surgery centers or outpatient centers. So anytime CMS changes the regulations, the renewing agencies automatically pick up. That's their job. Otherwise, they have no job. So I take it for granted that if we come up with different, maybe not tougher, but maybe different minimum standards, all four agencies have no choice, whether they're renewed or not, to pick up those things. So I don't think it's going to make a difference whether we stop the renewal process or continue the renewal process, because as we change, the agencies who are doing on our behalf have to change.
Might I suggest that this conversation can go on for hours? And in all due fairness, the chair has appointed a task force, and the responsibility of that task force is to pull together information and participation. And so I would recommend that we give the system the chance to work, and would move that. So I would just move that the conversation needs to be, instead of what if, let's get some task force moving on collecting the information and getting back to us in a July meeting.
And I fully support that. And I also like Mr. Hepler's suggestion, which I think will really help frame the discussion at the task force and then at the full board meeting in terms of the spectrum of possibilities. If you could include in that legal sort of analysis, if you will, or the steps that go with it and its legal ramifications and policy ramifications, if we took action pursuant to this box, when would that rule, or whatever you want to call it, attach? That's something I'm also interested in. So
certainly.
So we're going with the hit the gas, not the hit the brakes model.
Yeah, however you want to. Yeah, I think that's okay. we get there the same way.
Especially in a nonviolent world, we're going to do that, right?
They're sort of polar opposites.
Okay, great. Any other comments from the board? Do you want to continue with the other parts of your report?
The next part of my report would be with Mr. Hepler, which would be
let's move on the agenda.
About the accreditation standard.
Right. Okay. I think isn't there a brief interruption for Ms. Katie and Ms. Threadgill on the enforcement process?
The complaint process.
The complaint process.
The complaint process before us, if they want.
Okay.
Mr. Warden and Ms. Ingram, before you leave, could you actually walk the members through a surgery site search? I would like them to see what that looks like. Yes, so you can understand where you click and look on it. And we were going to actually ask the members to walk through this when we were going through, but we'd really encourage you, like Ms. Yaroslavsky said, to go out and look at the site and look at the FAQs and see if there's anything that we are missing on our site. But if you could just do a search on one of the facilities so you could see that.
Quick doesn't look like
By setting or by owner?
Here. So you're putting in a name, right? And then you're going to show us what shows up. We can't hear you because you're not speaking into the microphone. You know what? I think maybe what we need to do is send directions to the board members about how to do this. I'm afraid we don't have the time. Sorry. Wow.
Looks better.
There was.
Yeah, it looks great.
Very cool.
Oh, nice green checks.
We've added this information down here so that people know that when they click on the green check, that they can actually see the information, more detailed information.
Is there a way for homework that you could email board members the name of a facility that is accredited appropriately, and maybe a facility that has not been accredited appropriately, or that has had issues, how to walk through the system, and then maybe make a demonstration at the next meeting, so that we could all be on the same page? It's not me, I didn't do it.
So, so bottom line, we're still not able to say how many of the accreditation agencies are fully in compliance with data submission that they're required to submit. But we will be by July.
Correct.
Okay.
That flag will be there.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, Ms. Threadgill and Ms. Katie.
You start.
And we're hitting the gas.
All right.
We've got some flights people are worried about.
The concerns about procedures being performed under anesthesia in outpatient surgery setting is not a new complaint issue for the medical board. We have been reviewing complaint issues regarding surgery settings for at least 13 years, since 2216 was added to the Medical Practice Act. When evaluating complaints about procedures performed in an outpatient setting, we must first determine whether the setting is one that would fall under the board's purview and would require accreditation. For example, if the setting is certified to participate in Medicare or is a federally operated facility or a facility operating on tribal grounds, the setting would be exempt from the requirement to be accredited. The enforcement program staff would then confer with licensing to identify whether the facility is accredited through one of the 4 approved accreditation agencies. The next issue that must be considered is identifying whether the procedure that is being performed is with a level of anesthesia that has the probability of placing a patient at risk for loss of the patient's life-preserving protective reflexes. It can be difficult for complaint unit staff to determine whether the combination of drugs administered to a patient meets this criterion without input from a medical expert. CCU, our Central Complaint Unit, has several medical reviewers who have experience performing inspections as a part of an accreditation team to assist in determining whether the level of anesthesia used would require that the facility be accredited. If the combination of drugs being used does not meet the level of general anesthesia, the surgery setting does not require accreditation. It is fairly common for issues related to outpatient surgery settings to be identified through a complaint filed about the quality of care a physician provided. When the patient's medical records are obtained, staff can confirm whether the level of anesthesia was such that would require the setting be accredited, and then verify whether the setting is licensed, exempt, or accredited. If the setting is not accredited, the complaint is then referred for further investigation, regardless of whether the care and treatment was appropriate.
Thank you. On page 4, under tab 8D in your package is a chart that outlines the board's responsibility in responding to complaints received about surgery settings. The Health and Safety Code requires that the accrediting agency perform an inspection or an investigation in response to a complaint forwarded by the board and provides timeframes for responding back to the board when the investigation or inspection is completed. I've also included in your package and have up on the overhead a chart entitled Complaint Process, which displays how the board responds to complaints received, specifically naming the outpatient surgery setting. The complaint can be received either through the licensing program or in the central complaint unit. The first step is to identify whether the setting is accredited or not. If the setting is accredited, the complaint will be referred to the accrediting agency for inspection. When the inspection report is received in licensing, the findings are then reviewed to identify if any deficiencies were noted in areas related to patient safety. If so, a complaint of the inspection report will be referred to the complaint unit to be initiated and referred for formal investigation. If the setting is not accredited, the complaint is initiated and initially reviewed by the complaint unit. If the allegations indicate that procedures are being performed under general anesthesia, the complaint will be referred for investigation. A case would also be initiated on the physician who is alleged to have performed the procedure, as it could represent a violation of 2216. Remember, any complaint that comes to the complaint unit regarding the care provided by a physician in a surgery center would be handled strictly through enforcement in the process that was described by Renee. The board has received a total of 5 complaints regarding outpatient surgery centers from January 1st, 2012 to present. I've provided a handout with some basic information about these complaints. 4 of the 5 complaints allege that procedures were being performed in an unaccredited surgery center. All of those complaints were received within the last 6 months, and the investigations are still in progress. The 1 remaining complaint was referred to the dental board as the facility was owned by an oral surgeon. SB 100 also requires the accrediting agency to inspect the settings no less often than every 3 years. The inspection reports are to be provided to the board and posted on the website for public viewing. The next flow chart in your package displays the review that will occur when an accrediting agency identifies deficiencies during the regular inspection or takes action against the setting to either suspend, revoke, or place the setting on probation. It is important to remember that the physicians can continue to perform procedures at an outpatient setting that is not accredited, but they cannot use the level of anesthesia which places the patient at risk for loss of life-preserving protective reflexes. SB 100 did make outpatient surgery settings subject to the same adverse event reporting requirements that are currently in place for hospitals and other licensed healthcare facilities. We've met with representatives from the Department of Public Health to discuss these new reporting requirements, as the law does require that those reports be filed with them. We will continue to work with Public Health to ensure that we are receiving any adverse event reports filed by accredited outpatient settings. Any questions about the complaint process?
I have just one question.
Sure.
So what is the status? Ms. Whitney sent a letter to the Department of Public Health in December of 2012. Yes. They answered the letter in April of 2013.
Yes.
Is the MOU signed? Do we need an MOU? I mean, it's now 6 months.
Right. We still have not been able to affect an MOU.
we're going to be setting up a meeting with CDPH because at this time, based on the information they've said they will provide, if it's only in aggregate form, that doesn't do us any good for our investigations.
Right.
So because of that, we do need to meet with them now and enter into a formal MOU, although they said it's not necessary, but it's not necessary in that they're sending us aggregate data. That's not going to work. It's nothing to us at that point. So we will be setting up a meeting in the near future, and hopefully we'll have at the July board meeting the outcome of that meeting, and hopefully by that time we'll say I don't think an MOU will be signed by that time, because I know with DPH it takes a long time through their legal process for an MOU, but we will definitely be talking to them about that process and so we can get the information that's beneficial to us.
Okay. Dr. Bishop.
As an anesthesiologist, I keep hearing you folks say something about a level of medication or anesthesia which is likely to induce a loss of life-protecting reflexes. And I think people may get the wrong impression that this is a digital event and it's the same for everybody. And it's not. It's very specially for each individual patient in each individual situation and each individual surgery. And I would just caution against letting anybody off the hook without really excellent anesthetic expert testimony, not someone who's been accredited, who's been experiencing accreditation. It has to be an anesthesiology trained individual because we know the best. And I can tell you day to day, the amount of drug that puts someone out with no reflexes in one person can be nothing to another person. Age doesn't determine it necessarily. Medical status doesn't either. So I just want to be cautious that someone who doesn't really understand say, oh, well, that 3 of Versed, that would be nothing, when that could put someone completely out and not breathing in another individual.
Okay. Thank you. Board members, any questions? Members of the public, any questions or comments on 8D? Tina?
Tina Manassian. I'm here on behalf of the Consumers Union Safe Patient Project Now to speak with you about issues related to physician-owned surgery centers. The medical board should suspend the process or take other effective action to assure common sense of renewing the privileges of the 4 accredited agencies until some patient protection standards are promulgated, including the following. Require that physicians performing surgeries that require general anesthesia in physician-owned outpatient centers be board certified or board eligible, and also have hospital privileges for the specialty procedures they're performing. As it stands now, according to the testimony at the medical board's April 25th meeting, only one of the 4 accredited agencies requires this. That accreditor called it a, quote, non-negotiable item. The others allow the owners of these surgery centers to create their own rules for who can perform which surgeries. Require that surgery centers provide charts for review by the accreditors in cases where the patient had to be transferred to an acute care facility. Require that physicians who own outpatient surgery centers immediately forward to the medical board all citations, findings, and actions taken against the surgery center relating to patient safety. Require that surgery centers seeking accreditation post a notice at the surgery center 6 months prior, letting employees, patients, and the public know how to confidentially contact the accrediting agency. Require that future inspections be unannounced. Assure that outpatient surgery centers post the name and telephone number of their accrediting agency with the instructions on the submission of complaints. In addition, the medical board should take steps to assure that the information on its website regarding outpatient surgery centers is as accurate, complete, and useful as possible. The medical board should post on its website the history of accreditation for physician-owned ambulatory surgery centers. The medical board should link the physician's license lookup section of its website with the outpatient surgery setting section of its website, and should identify in the physician lookup all outpatient surgery centers the physician has an ownership interest in. The medical board should include on the outpatient surgery setting section of its website the number and type of adverse events reported by each physician-owned outpatient surgery center, and information about fines assessed for failure to report. Also, communications need to be put in place to inform physicians of their responsibility to report adverse events that occur in their outpatient surgery centers. In addition, the board should have a clear understanding of whose staff Medical Board, or California Department of Public Health will assess fines as required by SB 100 when adverse events are unreported. Hundreds and thousands of surgeries, such as the placement of heart stents, lobectomies for women with breast cancer, hysterectomies, back surgeries, gallbladder removals, orthopedic surgeries, weight loss surgeries, and cosmetic surgeries are being performed in California at these physician-owned surgery centers. We urge the Medical Board to apply rigorous oversight to these surgery centers and their accredited agencies. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you very much, and thank you for providing written comments. Any other public comments on this? If not, thank you very much. And we will move on to agenda item 8E, and that is my agenda item. Oh, sorry. Did I cut you off? I thought you'd already given your report.
Madam President, members, I
Please
would
go ahead.
defer to the board in this regard. Number one, we have a couple of upcoming events. We would have the meeting of the task force. We also sort of had a kind of animated and robust discussion about accreditation standards sort of already with the first bullet item. So I don't know what the board's pleasure is. If you want us to present, our material essentially was talking about the accreditation standards that are in place in law. Those, I think, number one, will be reviewed by the task force, and two, we already had a discussion of them. So if you want us to proceed, we will, or we can wait until the July board meeting, whichever the board wants.
Yeah, and I'd suggest we wait. And one of the things that we had asked for was a side-by-side look, not at the minimum standards, but at the different standards used by the different accrediting agencies, and that will be part of the task force's look. So I think we can wait till July to do that.
Certainly.
Thank you very much. And so the last item on the agenda, or last item in 8, agenda item 8 is 8E, and that is relating to the disciplinary guidelines. And there are two issues that arose during Sunset Review that we've been spending a fair amount of time thinking about and looking at. One is ISO's interim suspension orders, and the other is disciplinary guidelines. And we clarified at our last board meeting the difference between guidelines and standards. And in fact, the disciplinary guidelines are intended to create the ability for the board to evaluate the facts and circumstances, and for the administrative law judges to evaluate the facts and circumstances of a case and to make judgments about the appropriate discipline. And in fact, the manual of model disciplinary orders and disciplinary guidelines states that deviation from these orders and guidelines, including the standard terms of probation, is appropriate where the Medical Board of California, in its sole discretion, determines by adoption of a proposed decision or stipulation that the facts of the particular case warrant such a deviation. For example, the presence of either mitigating factors, the age of the case, evidentiary problems, or sometimes the presence of aggravating factors that require us, and we have done so multiple times every year, to impose a discipline that goes beyond what the disciplinary guidelines are. That being said, one of the things that we are, I would say, hampered by is the current mechanism we have and the format of reporting on both the office or the administrative law judge and AG's office. The report on discipline and the way we track that doesn't either capture in an extractable way the rationale for deviation, whether or not the disciplinary guidelines were met, whether they were exceeded or there was a modification for lesser discipline, the rationale for that. And so when challenged to say, well, what percentage of the time are your disciplinary guidelines adhered to, and what's the basis for not doing it, the mechanism we have currently is to go through case by case, go through the newsletter, if you will, and look at the stipulations and the proposed and the decisions. And so we need, in order to meet, I think, our obligation to be able to represent the work that we do in an accurate and fair way, we actually need to think about a process for capturing that information in a way that we can document over time the basis for deviation from the guidelines. Not that the guidelines are intended to be standards, but if there is deviation, I think it is reasonable for members of the public to say, so explain why. And so that is going to require some work, which I have been told is going to take us, we can't really begin to do until after BREEZE is implemented in terms of looking at reformatting or looking at capturing data in a different way. But I do think it's something important to do, and I just wanted board members to know that it's at a point appropriate. I'm going to bring that issue back to the board. And similarly with the issue of the interim suspension orders, questions were raised about the number of times we seek it and why, if we're not successful in getting an interim suspension order. And there is pending legislation. SB 304 contains an extension of the time between an ISO being granted and the time to file an accusation. And one of the reasons that there is hesitation on the part of the Attorney General's office is the lack of confidence that we can actually complete and file an accusation in what is the current standard, which is 15 days. And so we are hopeful that that will remain in the legislation, will pass, and will give us a better chance at convincing attorneys to grant an interim suspension order. In addition to that, two other things that are happening. The medical board has approved a training for that will be put on by the Office of Administrative Hearings for the administrative law judges on the topic of ISOs, and that will be happening on June 28th, so that they will, to refamiliarize them with the process, the circumstances, and why the board will be coming to the judges requesting an interim suspension order. And hopefully that educational process will enable this to be a smoother process. And also there will be similarly a training on the medical board's disciplinary guidelines for a training for the medical boards on the medical board's disciplinary guidelines through the Office of Administrative Hearing this summer, again to bring people up to speed on the guidelines again, so that in the process of making decisions people will be cognizant of, again, thinking about the rationale for either using the guidelines, or if deviating from them, documenting the fact that there is deviation and what the rationale is. So just wanted to let folks know that we...
Yeah, I just have one comment. Is it possible for the AG's office to adopt a more standardized form in their letter to us, to panels A and B, in terms of the same format all the time for all the offices, so that we have the same kinds of information, background, and so forth and so on, plus included in that, whatever they recommend, it should state whether or not it is consistent with the disciplinary guidelines, and if not, they frequently explain why, but I mean, it would be nice for us to have that data. In addition, for the proposed stipulations, it would be nice if somebody from the Meds board staff could put a little note into that's to the panel members about the deviation, so that we have that right at hand. I mean, that's so easy to do, and that would make it more consistent.
Very good suggestions, and it does start, I think, with the AG. Questions from board members? Any?
I was going to just move to adjourn.
No, final agenda items for the next meeting, right?
We need agenda items for the next meeting. Members, I have to ask members of the public if there are any comments on that. Hearing none, we'll move on to agenda items for the next board meeting. Dr. Lowe?
So I wanted to bring up this as a possible point of discussion, and that is that public protection sometimes takes the form of making sure that patients are allowed to get the right kind of test or the right kind of medications, and that they're not denied by some utilization review physician who's a paid member of a third-party reviewer system. So this is especially dear to me because this past week I tried to get a 19-year-old approved to have a CT coronary angiogram. They put contrast in, it takes 5 minutes. And I was denied by a third party, and I asked for the physician reviewer's name, and she would only give me her last name. She would not identify herself. Totally inappropriate. They wanted me to go and put a catheter into this patient's heart to take the same pictures that I could get with a 5-minute non-invasive test. And that's not even cheaper. Plus, this person, I find out her name through other sources, and I realize the person denying this to a cardiologist is a pediatric allergist paid for by a specialty reviewer company. So clearly, the board should take some strong position about utilization review physicians, that they are held to the standard of practice. And they can't rely on a bunch of documents given to them by an insurance company to practice medicine in California when the insurance company is not even here.
And I think, so and Ms. Chung asked us to actually agendize that also.
What's that?
At the last board meeting, which we did, right. Anything?
Not necessarily for the next meeting, but I would like to see this in a future agenda perhaps. The Department of Healthcare Services of California approached me with concerns that there's a massive amount of fraud in the state. And one of the victims of this is the new physicians coming out of residency, because they are relatively naive about the whole process. And these criminals who are very good at this try to find new physicians and lure them into these situations to use their provider identification number for great profit. And it ends up the physician is the one that in the end gets hurt the most because their professional life may be ruined by this. These people actually came to our board in the past and were denied access to the board. So I'd like to reconsider having them give us a presentation in an upcoming meeting at some point in time. They're very willing to accommodate us at any location, at any time. And I think it's very useful as an outreach to our new physicians coming into the state to avoid this sort of problem.
And it was DHCS that wanted to come?
I can provide you with the names if you'd like.
Great.
Madam Chair. Earlier today when we were on item 8A, Dr. Ganadev made a motion. We had some discussion. Staff, legal counsel recommended that we not adopt the motion. I wanted clarification first. On our board agenda, it says action may be taken on any item listed on the agenda. So I just want to get clarification on that for the future, just so we can follow some procedure. And so I was operating on the basis that we could act on any item. And two, there seems to be a great deal of urgency about enforcement. And so in that regard, I think there was a good dialogue. Dr. Lowe referenced more immediate steps. I'm looking at something that might be a little more comprehensive that could be done concurrently, because I think long-term reform requires outreach to a number of different stakeholder groups and communication before something's adopted and, in essence, put into practice. So if we could agendize a request at our next meeting, agendizing that as an action item, so if there's specific direction given, we can tie some timelines to it with some direct report back and put that on a track, even if it's a dual track, that would be appreciated. And then in closing, I'd say if we get clarification from legal in regards to what's listed on our agenda sheet as anything could be an action item.
So, I'm sorry, I got the clarification from legal, but the agenda item you want?
I think that it's specific to enforcement and the issue of enforcement. There's a full array of items we've discussed, and if we bring the enforcement question up as an action item, I think as the board deliberates on specifics, as we give the staff direction, those are direction as it relates to specific tasks, actions with timetables that we can then adopt and say that by the direction of the board, by resolution, we've given action that this will happen by a certain date.
Okay. And that'll come through the enforcement committee.
I can clarify the legal issue also with Kurt's and Diane's input if they want, but the agenda does say that action may be taken on any item listed on the agenda, but the way it's worded on the second page, under 8, it's identified as a status update, and it's just not as clear as we would like it to be if it went through legal review.
That's because I wrote the agenda.
Okay.
So things where we intend to take action, it should be identified as an action item on the agenda and not just rely on the statement on the first page.
Understood. So just for clarification then, in directing staff, sometimes instead of allowing there to ever be a committee of one, sometimes the direction of staff by consensus or by vote lets the staff know that the board has a consensus or even is unanimous in giving staff the direction, respectful of limited resources. In other matters, then I guess is something purely informational. For example, like open forum, oftentimes people will come and speak, and these are not action items, but the board's just then taking information. So to clarify that point, then I just think that it's important that we try to find a way to be able to make sure that we can emphasize when there's specific action we would like the staff to take, and with a timetable and by when, so there's no ambiguity or confusion regarding urgency. And in other cases, if we're underscoring that we're really asking the board not to take any action because we just want to discuss it, then we're identifying it as just an item for discussion.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
Madam President, just a couple of meetings of housekeeping. So the things that I have, Ms. Kirkmeyer, perhaps we can get on the same page. The things that are due would be, I think, Ms. Sweet's safety prescribing team report and the allocation of the 6 north and south investigators. That report will have the outpatient surgery, outpatient setting, legal memo of some options. We'll have also the SB 1441 regulatory language. Those are the 3 absolutes that I have that will be on the agenda for next meeting.
We also have carryover from our April meeting items, including staff report on follow-up to the joint forum. Ms. Shipsky had requested an update on the Board of Pharmacy activities, report back on teleconference options. That's also for the July meeting, and
Report on the gag clause.
report on the gag clause.
Madam Chair, one last item. In my enthusiasm, I recall hearing discussion that there was maybe a task force on enforcement.
There's an enforcement committee.
Enforcement committee. So the question, just for my edification, I don't know when that is scheduled to meet next. And I understand that the committees, our staff are populated with 2 commissioners, and
actually, the enforcement and licensing committee have multiple board members.
Okay. So I guess the question is, are they scheduled to meet prior to our next meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, generally right before or during the meeting, but not as part of the meeting.
Okay, fair point. So just, again, thank you for the latitude in the question. I guess if we could ask that committee or its chair, as a part of then this ongoing discussion that we've just requested, calendared as a potential action item.
Absolutely.
That we get a report from them with some recommendations, and so the board would be able to consider that as part of its deliberation.
That's the plan.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, any other agenda items? I think we've got a good bit of information and material for our July board meeting. If not, then the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.